A frozen ranch, 3 terrified children, one man willing to risk everything. When Caleb Rourke opened his cabin door on that bitter January night, he expected wolves or wind, not 3 shivering children begging for sanctuary until sunrise. But the oldest boy's haunted eyes told a story darker than any Montana blizzard, and the moment Caleb let them cross his threshold, he stepped into a battle that would force him to choose between the law he once served and the justice he still believed in. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below so I can see how far this story travels. And if it touches your heart, hit that like button and stay until the very end, because what starts as one desperate night becomes something far more powerful. The wind came down from the Bitterroot Range like a living thing, hungry and cold, rattling the shutters of Caleb Rourke's cabin with skeletal fingers. He'd learned to read that wind over 7 winters alone on this mountain, knew when it carried snow, when it brought nothing but empty cold, when it whispered warnings about the wolves moving down from higher ground. Tonight it sounded different. Caleb set down the leather harness he'd been mending and tilted his head, listening past the fire's crackle and the wind's moan. His hands, scarred and capable, rested quiet on his knees. The Colt revolver he'd carried as a territorial marshal hung on the wall beside the door, close enough to reach but far enough away that he didn't think about it every hour of every day anymore. Most nights, anyway. The knock came soft and uncertain, barely louder than the wind itself. Caleb was on his feet before the second knock fell, moving with the economy of motion that 7 years behind a badge had burned into his bones. He took the Colt from its hook and approached the door from the side, old instincts screaming that decent folk didn't come calling after dark in January, not this far up the mountain, not unless something had gone terribly wrong. "State your business," he called through the heavy pine door. Silence. Then a child's voice, thin and careful. "Please, mister. We just need shelter till sunrise. We won't be trouble." Caleb's hand froze on the bolt. A child. No. Children, plural. He could hear breathing now, ragged and quick, more than one person fighting to stay quiet and failing. He opened the door. 3 pairs of eyes stared up at him from faces bluish with cold. The oldest was a boy, maybe 12, with dark hair plastered to his forehead and a jaw set so hard it trembled. He stood in front of the other 2 like a shield, one arm stretched back to keep them behind him. A girl, perhaps 9, peered around his shoulder with eyes that seemed too old for her face, and clutched against the boy's side, barely visible in the darkness, a smaller child, couldn't be more than 5, pressed into his brother's coat like he was trying to disappear. All 3 wore clothes too thin for the cold, no coats worth mentioning, shoes that looked more like rags tied around their feet. Ice clung to their hair and eyelashes. The oldest boy's lips were cracked and bleeding. "Jesus Christ," Caleb breathed. "We don't want no trouble, sir," the boy said again, and his voice carried an adult's weariness despite its unbroken pitch. "Just let us warm up till dawn, then we'll go. You'll never see us again." Caleb looked past them into the darkness, searching for whoever had brought children this far up a frozen mountain and left them at a stranger's door. But the night revealed nothing except snow beginning to fall, thick and fast. "Get inside." He stepped back, pulling the door wide. "Now." The boy hesitated, suspicion warring with desperation in his face. Then the smallest child made a sound, a whimper caught between chattering teeth, and the decision made itself. The boy ushered his siblings through the door, never taking his eyes off Caleb, never letting them get too far from his reach. Caleb closed the door against the wind and turned to find all 3 children frozen just inside, dripping snowmelt onto his floor, staring at the fire like they'd forgotten what warmth looked like. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the hearth. When they didn't move, he gentled his voice the way he would with a spooked horse. "By the fire, before you freeze to death in my house and make me feel guilty." The girl moved first, drawn toward the heat with her hands already stretched out. The oldest boy followed, keeping himself between Caleb and the others, and the little one, Caleb could see now it was another boy, barely more than a baby, came last, never making a sound, his eyes huge and dark in his small face. Caleb hung the Colt back on its hook and moved to the stove where coffee sat keeping warm. He poured 3 tin cups of water, added a spoonful of honey to each, and brought them to the children. "Drink this slow. Your bellies are too cold for anything else right now. The girl took her cup with both hands, whispered, "Thank you," so soft he almost missed it. The oldest boy accepted his but didn't drink, watching Caleb with the kind of vigilance that came from experience, the kind that expected betrayal as surely as sunrise. The little one wouldn't take the cup at all. He pressed tighter against his brother's side, and Caleb saw his lips were blue, his small body shaking so hard the tremors looked painful. "He don't talk," the oldest boy said. "Hasn't for a long time. But he ain't simple." "Didn't figure he was." Caleb crouched down, making himself smaller, less threatening. He set the cup on the floor within the child's reach. "What's his name?" The boy hesitated, clearly weighing how much truth to give. "Ben." "Ben," Caleb repeated, meeting those frightened eyes. "I'm Caleb. This is my home. You're safe here." The child stared at him, and Caleb saw something flicker in that small face. Not trust, nothing so simple, but maybe the beginning of hope that safety might be possible, somewhere, sometime. "I'm Luke," the oldest boy said, and it sounded like a concession. "This is Mara, and Ben, like I said." Luke, Mara, Ben. Caleb committed the names to memory the way he used to memorize wanted posters. "When did you eat last?" Mara and Luke exchanged glances. "Yesterday morning," Mara said. "There was bread at a farm we passed." "They give it to you?" Her silence was answer enough. Caleb stood and moved to his larder, pulling out cornbread left from his own supper, a jar of preserved venison, apples from the root cellar. He laid it all on the table and stepped back. "Eat what you want. There's more." They fell on the food like wolves, trying to maintain dignity and failing. Even Ben reached out with small, frozen fingers to grab a piece of cornbread, stuffing it in his mouth so fast Caleb worried he'd choke. "Slow," he said gently. "It's not going anywhere." But they couldn't slow down, and he understood why. Children who'd gone hungry enough times never quite believed the food would still be there in 5 minutes. He'd seen it before during the war, in the lean years after. Hunger taught lessons that lasted. He let them eat in peace, using the time to study them more carefully. Their clothes were institutional, rough cotton shirts and pants, all the same dull gray, the kind of uniforms orphanages and work farms used. The fabric was worn thin, patched badly in places, not nearly enough protection against Montana winter. Their shoes were worse, split at the seams, soles separating from uppers, held together with what looked like wire and desperate hope. But it was their hands that told the real story. Luke's were calloused and scarred, knuckles swollen from work too hard for a boy his age. Mara's fingers were red and cracked, marked with small burns, kitchen work, probably, endless scrubbing and scalding water. Ben's were the worst, small and delicate but covered in old bruises, yellowing around the edges, the kind that came from being struck repeatedly. Caleb felt something cold settle in his chest, colder than the wind outside. When the first desperate edge of their hunger dulled, he spoke again. "How long have you been running?" Luke's hand stilled halfway to his mouth. He set down the apple he'd been eating, and Caleb watched him make the calculation, lie and risk being caught in it, or tell the truth and risk consequences unknown. 3 days, he said finally. Maybe 4. Hard to tell. 3 days in this weather. Caleb kept his voice neutral, just gathering facts. That's a long time for children on foot with no provisions. We managed. I can see that. Question is, what are you running from? Luke's jaw went hard again. Don't matter. It matters if whoever you're running from comes knocking on my door looking for you. They won't. We were careful, didn't leave tracks they could follow. Son, you left tracks all the way up my mountain. I could follow them back myself if I wanted to. Fear flashed across Luke's face, quickly hidden. Mara set down her food, and Ben pressed closer to his brother, making himself small. I ain't turning you in, Caleb said, reading their panic, but I need to know what I'm dealing with. Men with guns, law, bounty hunters. The law, Mara whispered, but it ain't like you think. How about you tell me what it is like then? Luke shook his head. You'll just send us back. Try me. The boy studied him with eyes that had learned to read men the way some people read books, looking for the truth beneath the surface, the motive hiding behind kind words. Whatever he saw in Caleb's face made him slump a little, the rigid control easing just enough to show how exhausted he really was. "We were at Stillwater Institution," he said, "up near the territorial border. You heard of it?" Caleb had. An orphanage, supposedly, though rumors said it was more work farm than sanctuary. Children took in and put to labor, kept just legal enough to avoid scrutiny, but brutal enough that most didn't run. Most didn't survive long enough to try. "I've heard of it," he said carefully. "They had us for 2 years," Luke continued. "Mara and me came together after our ma died. Ben was already there. They keep the little ones separate from the older kids, work them in different places. Ben was in the laundry, steam and lie all day, kids his age handling equipment that could crush them if they slip." Mara's voice was barely audible. "He burned his hand real bad. The skin came off in sheets, but they wouldn't let him rest. Said if he couldn't work, they'd send him someplace worse." "There ain't no place worse," Luke said flatly. "That's when I knew we had to run. All 3 of us together. Ben's just a baby. He shouldn't have to—" His voice cracked, and he stopped, swallowing hard. Caleb felt that cold thing in his chest spread outward, turning to ice in his veins. "What about the law?" "They got contracts," Luke said. "Legal papers saying Stillwater has custody till we're 16. Says we're orphans and wards of the institution. Says they got the right to house us, feed us, educate us." He spat the word like poison. "And if we run, they can bring us back." "Contracts can be broken." "Not these. Director's got friends in the territorial government. Had marshals come through twice when other kids tried to run. Brought 'em back in chains." Luke's hands clenched into fists. "We ain't going back in chains. We ain't going back at all." Caleb looked at the 3 children huddled by his fire. 2 who'd been forced to grow up too fast. 1 who'd been hurt so badly he'd stopped speaking altogether. He thought about the institution that ground them down and called it care. He thought about contracts and custody, and the law he'd spent 7 years enforcing. "You said you need shelter till sunrise," he said. Luke nodded warily. "All right. You can stay till sunrise." Caleb stood, moving to pull quilts from the chest beneath his window. "But when the sun comes up, we're going to have a longer conversation about what happens next." "We'll be gone before you wake," Luke said. "You got my word. You'll be right here when I wake, or I'll track you down myself and drag you back." Caleb dropped the quilts beside them, heavy wool that still smelled faintly of the cedar chest. Because running in winter with no supplies and no destination is just dying slow. You're smart enough to know that. He moved to the loft ladder. "There's a chamber pot behind that curtain if you need it. Don't let the fire go out. There's wood by the hearth. And if you even think about stealing anything, know that I sleep light and I'm a fair shot in the dark." He climbed halfway up the ladder, then paused. "Luke." The boy looked up, shoulders tense. "I meant what I said earlier. You're safe here. At least till morning. Get some sleep." He finished climbing to his loft, settling onto his bed without undressing, the colt within easy reach. Below he heard the children's whispers, Luke's low murmur, Mara's soft responses. Ben's silence. Heard them arranging the quilts, banking the fire, settling as close to the hearth as they could get without scorching. The wind howled outside, and snow hissed against the windows. Caleb stared at the rough-hewn ceiling beams and wondered what in hell he was going to do come sunrise. But he woke before dawn to the smell of coffee. Caleb came down the ladder quietly, hand on the colt out of habit, and found Mara crouched by the stove, carefully feeding wood into the firebox. The coffee pot sat warming on top, and she'd laid out the last of the cornbread on the table. She startled when she saw him, going pale. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. We were just cold, and I thought—" "Coffee's a good idea," he said, gentling his voice again. "Thank you." Relief flooded her face. "Luke's still sleeping. He don't sleep good normally, but I think he was just too tired to stay awake." Caleb looked toward the hearth where Luke lay curled on his side, one arm stretched out to where Ben slept tucked against him. The little one's face was peaceful in sleep, the fear smoothed away temporarily. Luke's wasn't. Even unconscious, he looked braced for trouble, ready to wake fighting. "You didn't sleep?" Caleb asked Mara. "Somebody's got to keep watch." She said it so matter-of-factly, This child who should have been worried about schoolwork and hair ribbons, not survival and vigilance. Caleb felt anger kindle in his chest, not at her, but at every circumstance that had taught her to think this way. "You're not keeping watch anymore," he said. "That's my job now." "Till sunrise," you said. "Till we figure this out." Mara studied him with those two old eyes. "Why would you help us? You don't know us. Don't have to know you to see you need help. Most folks see that and turn away." Caleb poured himself coffee, adding a splash of cream from the tin he kept cold on the back porch. "I'm not most folks." "You was a lawman," she said. It wasn't a question. "I can tell. The way you move. The way you watch everything. Luke sees it too." "I was, long time ago. But you ain't anymore." "No." "Why not?" He took a long swallow of coffee, feeling the heat spread through his chest. "Because I learned that the law and justice aren't always the same thing." Mara considered this, her small face serious. Then, "That's why you'll help us, ain't it? Because the law says we belong to Stillwater, but justice says we don't." "Smart girl." "Not smart enough. If I was smart, I'd have gotten us out before Ben got hurt so bad he stopped talking." Her voice wavered, and she pressed her lips together hard. "He used to talk all the time. Used to sing even. Now he can't. Or won't. Doctor said there ain't nothing wrong with his throat or his head. He just decided words ain't safe anymore." Caleb set down his coffee. "Mara, how old are you?" 9. Almost 10. "And you think you're supposed to protect your brothers all by yourself?" "Somebody's gotta." "Not anymore. Not alone." She looked at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. The concept so strange she couldn't parse it. Before she could respond, Luke stirred by the fire, coming awake all at once the way soldiers did, eyes open, body tense, already assessing threats. "Easy," Caleb said. "Just morning. Nothing's wrong." Luke relaxed fractionally, then noticed Mara by the stove and sat up fast. "You should have woke me. I told you to wake me if anything." "Nothing happened," Mara said. "I just made coffee." "You shouldn't be up alone with—" He stopped, glancing at Caleb, clearly biting back whatever he'd been about to say. "With a strange man you don't trust," Caleb finished for him. "That's smart thinking, but your sister's fine, and you need to eat before we talk." Luke's eyes narrowed. "Talk about what?" "About what happens now that the sun's coming up." As if on cue, pale light began filtering through the eastern window, turning the snow outside from black to gray. Ben woke silently, sitting up and immediately looking for his brother. Luke pulled him close, and the little boy buried his face in Luke's shoulder. Caleb poured more coffee, set out the cornbread, added strips of dried venison to the offering. "Eat first, then we talk." They ate warily, watching him like deer at a waterhole watching for wolves. When they'd finished, Caleb refilled his coffee and settled into his chair by the fire. "Here's how I see it," he said. "You got 3 choices. 1, you can run again, hope to make it somewhere safe before the weather kills you or Stillwater finds you. 2, you can go back, hope things get better, probably get punished for running, and end up right where you started. 3, you can stay here while I figure out how to break those contracts legal-like and keep you out of that place permanent." Silence. Then Luke said, "Why would you do that?" "Because it needs doing. You don't even know us." "I know enough. Know you ran to protect your brother. Know Mara keeps watch so you can sleep. Know Ben got hurt bad enough he stopped talking, and nobody who was supposed to protect him did a damn thing about it." Caleb leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I know that's wrong, and I know I can't just send you back out into the snow and live with myself after. We ain't your responsibility. Maybe not, but you're here, and I'm choosing to make it my business." Luke's jaw worked. "The contracts are legal. You said so yourself. How you going to break something legal?" Carefully, and with help. Caleb thought about the few people he still trusted, the ones who'd stood by him when he turned in his badge rather than enforce laws he couldn't stomach. "I know a lawyer in Helena. Good man. Honest. If there's a way to break those contracts, he'll find it. And if there ain't, then we find another way. They'll come looking for us, Mara said softly. The director, he don't like losing workers. Says it sets a bad example. Let 'em come. This is my land and I decide who stays on it. Luke shook his head. You don't understand. He's got authority. Got papers and badges and I don't care what he's got. He's not taking you. The certainty in Caleb's voice seemed to shake something loose in Luke. The boy's rigid control cracked, and for just a moment Caleb saw past the protective shell to the exhausted, frightened child underneath. Why? Luke's voice broke. Why do you care? Caleb looked at the three of them, bruised, underfed, wearing clothes that marked them as property, carrying scars both visible and hidden. He thought about the law he'd served and the justice he'd sought, and how rarely the two aligned. Because 7 years ago, I had to choose between my badge and my conscience, he said. I chose conscience. Been living alone up here ever since, telling myself it was enough to not do harm. But seeing you three on my porch last night, I realized not doing harm isn't the same as doing right. He stood, moved to the window, looked out at the snow-covered mountain that had been his refuge and his penance. You asked for shelter till sunrise. Sun's up now. But I'm not turning you out and I'm not sending you back. You can stay as long as you need, days, weeks, however long it takes to make this right. That's my offer. What if we say no? Luke asked. Then I'll pack you supplies, point you toward the safest route, and spend the rest of my life wondering if you made it. Caleb turned back to face them. But I'm hoping you'll say yes. The children looked at each other in that silent communication siblings develop, entire conversations happening in glances and tiny gestures. Ben tugged at Luke's sleeve. Mara nodded slightly. Luke's throat worked as he swallowed hard. Just till you can break the contracts? He said. Till you're safe. However long that takes. Another long silence. Then, all right, we'll stay. But if trouble comes, we deal with it together. Luke nodded slowly, and some of the terrible tension holding him together eased. Not gone. That kind of wariness wouldn't disappear in a day or a week or maybe ever, but loosened enough that he could breathe a little easier. Ben pulled away from his brother and walked across the room to Caleb. He stopped just out of reach, studying Caleb's face with those huge dark eyes, searching for something. Then carefully, deliberately, he reached out and took Caleb's hand. His small fingers were cold and rough, scarred from burns and work. They wrapped around Caleb's palm and held on. Caleb felt something crack in his chest, some wall he'd built around himself during 7 years alone. He crouched down to Ben's level, giving the child his full attention. I won't let anyone hurt you, he said quietly. Any of you. You have my word. Ben didn't speak, couldn't or wouldn't, but his grip tightened, and that seemed like answer enough. The days that followed developed their own rhythm. Caleb set them to simple tasks, bringing in firewood, helping with morning chores, feeding the horses he kept in the small barn behind the cabin. Nothing like the brutal labor they'd endured at Stillwater, just enough to give structure to their days and help them feel useful rather than helpless. Luke took to the horses immediately, gentle hands and soft voice calming animals that spooked at sudden movements. Caleb watched him work and saw a natural gift, the kind that couldn't be taught. The boy had a way of reading what horses needed, anticipating their fears, offering reassurance without crowding them. You work with horses before? Caleb asked on the third morning, watching Luke curry the big gray mare. At Stillwater, in the stables. It was better than the fields. Luke's hands moved in steady strokes, following the grain of the mare's coat. They put the little kids in the fields during planting and harvest, put the older ones to heavier work. But I was good with the horses, so they kept me in the stables mostly. They treat the horses better than the children? Luke's mouth twisted. Horses are worth money. Caleb felt that anger kindle again, hot and sharp. He banked it the way he'd learned to bank fires, contained but ready to blaze up when needed. Mara claimed the kitchen as her domain, helping prepare meals with the focus of someone who'd learned to find safety in useful work. She kneaded bread with small, capable hands, tended the stove with careful attention, washed dishes in water she heated herself. You don't have to do all that, Caleb told her. You're not hired help. I like it, she said simply. Gives me something to do besides worry. What are you worried about? She glanced toward where Ben sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Him mostly. He ain't getting better. Caleb looked at the little boy, so silent and still. Maybe he just needs time. Maybe. Or maybe he's broken permanent. People don't break permanent. They just heal slow sometimes. Mara wanted to believe him. He could see it in her face. But hope was dangerous when you'd learn to live without it, and she couldn't quite let herself trust that things might get better. Ben remained silent, watching everything with those dark, haunted eyes. He followed Luke everywhere, staying close enough to touch, never making a sound. At night he had nightmares that woke him gasping and shaking, but when Luke tried to comfort him, he couldn't explain what he'd dreamed, couldn't or wouldn't speak the fear out loud. Caleb let him be mostly, offering presence without pressure. He read aloud sometimes in the evenings, simple stories, nothing too heavy, and noticed Ben inching closer to listen, drawn to the sound of words even if he wouldn't use them himself. On the fourth night, Caleb pulled out his old harmonica and played a few simple tunes. Nothing fancy, just melodies he'd learned during the war, songs about home and distance and longing. Ben watched his fingers move on the instrument, fascination overcoming fear. When Caleb finished, Ben reached out his hand, tentative. Want to try? Caleb offered the harmonica. Ben took it carefully, held it like something precious, put it to his lips, and blew softly. The note that came out was breathy and uncertain, but it was sound. Sound he'd chosen to make, intentional and his own. Luke and Mara froze, staring. Ben blew another note, then another, finding the melody through trial and error. It wasn't music exactly, but it was communication. It was trying. That's real good, Caleb said quietly. You're a natural. Ben looked up at him, and for the first time since they'd arrived, something like a smile ghosted across his small face. That night, Caleb lay in his loft and listened to the children settle, heard Luke's low murmur as he talked his siblings toward sleep, heard Mara's soft breathing evening out, heard Ben make one more quiet note on the harmonica before silence fell. He thought about the lawyer in Helena, the letter he needed to write, thought about breaking contracts and fighting institutions and going up against the territorial government, thought about how much easier it would be to just let them go, wish them well, and return to his quiet, solitary life. Then he thought about Ben's smile, barely there but real. No, there was no going back now. On the fifth morning, riders came up the mountain. Caleb spotted them from the barn where he was helping Luke muck stalls. 3 men on horseback, moving slowly through the snow, following the same path the children had taken almost a week before. He felt his body go still, instincts screaming warnings. Luke, get your brother and sister. Get them in the cellar under the cabin. Now. The boy's face went white. They found us. Don't know yet, but I'm not taking chances. Go. Luke ran, and Caleb moved to the cabin to retrieve his rifle. Not the Colt, something with more range and stopping power. He checked the loads, made sure the action worked smooth, then positioned himself on the porch where he could see the riders approach. They came on slow, hands visible, no weapons drawn. But Caleb had been a lawman long enough to know that meant nothing. Men who were truly dangerous didn't need to advertise it. The lead rider stopped his horse 30 feet from the porch. He was middle-aged, well-fed, wearing a wool coat that cost more than most men made in a month. His face had the ruddy confidence of someone used to getting his way. "Good morning," he called out. "I'm looking for a man named Caleb Rourke." "You found him." "Excellent. My name is Curtis Blackwell. I'm the director of Stillwater Institution." He smiled, affable and practiced. "I believe you may have some property of mine." Caleb's hands tightened on the rifle. "I don't have any property of yours." 3 children, been missing for nearly a week now. We tracked them to this mountain, and your cabin is the only structure for miles. Blackwell's smile never wavered. "Surely you can understand my concern for their welfare." "If you were concerned for their welfare, they wouldn't have run in the first place." The smile flickered. "Mr. Rourke, I don't know what tales they've told you, but these children are wards of my institution. I have legal custody, and I'm sure a former marshal like yourself understands the importance of respecting legal authority." "I understand that legal and right aren't always the same thing." Nevertheless, the law is the law. I must insist you return them immediately. Caleb leveled the rifle, not quite pointing it at Blackwell, but making his position clear. And I must insist you turn around and ride back down this mountain. The two men flanking Blackwell shifted in their saddles. One of them, lean and hard-eyed, with a deputy's star pinned to his coat, rested his hand on his holstered revolver. "Mr. Rourke," Blackwell said, his voice hardening, "I have legal documents granting me custody. I have a territorial deputy here to enforce those documents, and I have every right to retrieve property that belongs to my institution. They're not property, they're children. Children bound by legal contract to remain in my care until they reach the age of majority. If you refuse to return them, you're harboring runaways and interfering with legal custody. That's a criminal offense." "Then I guess I'm a criminal." The deputy spoke for the first time, his voice flat and professional. "Sir, you don't want to do this. Step aside and let us collect the children. Nobody needs to get hurt." Caleb looked at him, really looked. Saw a man doing a job, following orders, probably believing he was on the right side of this. Saw someone who'd convinced himself that legal made it moral. "You know what they do to children at that place?" Caleb asked quietly. "I know they provide shelter, food, and education to orphans who'd otherwise starve. They work them till they break. Beat them when they complain. Put 5-year-olds in laundries with boiling water and lie. One of those children you're here to collect stopped talking because he got hurt so bad. And you want to drag him back there in chains?" Something flickered in the deputy's face, doubt maybe, or discomfort, but it passed quickly, buried under duty and authority. "What I want doesn't matter. I have a job to do." "So did I once. Then I realized some jobs aren't worth doing." Blackwell's patience frayed visibly. "Enough of this. Deputy, you have your authority. Use it." The deputy's hand moved toward his gun. Caleb raised the rifle, smooth and certain. "Don't." The other man with Blackwell, bigger, meaner looking, no badge but plenty of scars, started to draw. Caleb swung the rifle toward him. "You either." They froze in a tableau of violence waiting to happen. 3 men with hands on weapons, 1 man standing alone between them and what they'd come for. All of them breathing cold air and measuring odds and deciding how far they were willing to go. "This is foolish," Blackwell said. "There are 3 of us and 1 of you. You can't win." "Maybe not, but I can make it expensive." Caleb's voice was calm, almost conversational. "Question is, are you willing to pay the price?" "I have the law on my side." "You have legal documents, not the same thing." "Deputy, I'm ordering you to—" The sound of horses coming fast up the mountain cut him off. All heads turned toward the trail, hands tightening on weapons, and Caleb felt his heart sink. If Blackwell had brought more men, this was about to get ugly. But the riders who appeared weren't reinforcements. There were 5 of them, and the man in the lead wore a silver star that caught the morning light. Not a deputy's star, a federal marshal's badge. Behind him rode 4 more lawmen, all armed, all watching the scene with sharp attention. The lead marshal stopped his horse, taking in the situation with experienced eyes. Then he looked at Caleb, and recognition lit his weathered face. "Rourke? That you?" Caleb felt something unlock in his chest. Haynes. Thomas Haynes, federal marshal, a man Caleb had ridden with during his years behind a badge. A man who'd understood when Caleb turned in his star and never judged him for it. "Heard you were living up here like a hermit," Haynes said, dismounting. "Thought I'd ride up and check on you. Seems I picked an interesting time." "Seems you did." Haynes turned to Blackwell. "And who might you be?" "Curtis Blackwell, director of Stillwater Institution. I'm here on legal business, retrieving runaway wards. This man is interfering." "That's so?" Haynes looked at Caleb. "What's your side?" 3 children showed up at my door almost a week ago, starved, frozen, covered in bruises. They ran from Stillwater because they were being worked half to death and beaten for complaining. I'm not letting them go back." Haynes considered this. Then, to Blackwell, "Let me see those custody documents." Blackwell produced a folder from his saddlebag, handed it over with the confidence of a man certain of his legal standing. Haynes read through the papers slowly, his expression giving nothing away. Finally, he looked up. These documents say the children are wards of Stillwater Institution. They say you have custody and authority to house them, feed them, and put them to work. They say runaways can be returned by force if necessary. Caleb's grip on the rifle tightened. Then Haynes tore the documents in half. What they don't say, he continued, is that you have the right to abuse them. They don't say you can work children till they break. They don't say you can injure a child so badly he stops speaking and face no consequences. This is outrageous, Blackwell sputtered. You have no authority to— I have federal authority, which trumps your territorial contracts, and I have eyes which tell me those children were abused in your care. So here's what's going to happen. Haynes stepped closer to Blackwell, and his voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. You're going to ride back to Stillwater. You're going to gather up every contract, every document, every record you have, and you're going to surrender them to me for investigation. Because if what Rourke says is true, you're not just losing these 3 children, you're losing your entire operation. You can't. The territorial government will cooperate with a federal investigation or face charges of their own. I've been hearing rumors about Stillwater for 2 years. Never had enough evidence to act, but now I do. Now I have a federal officer as a witness and 3 children who can testify to what happened. Blackwell's face went purple. Those children are liars. They'll say anything to avoid returning to proper discipline. Then you'll have your chance to prove that in court. But until then, those kids stay with Rourke, and you stay away from this mountain. That clear enough for you? The silence stretched out, broken only by wind in the pines and horses stamping in the cold. Finally, Blackwell jerked his reins, turning his mount. The deputy and the scarred man followed, and all 3 rode away down the mountain without another word. Caleb let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Haynes turned to him, and the ghost of a smile touched his weathered face. Hell of a retirement you've got here, Rourke. Wasn't planning on it getting this exciting. Never does. Haynes glanced toward the cabin. The children inside, hiding in the root cellar, scared half to death. Let's get them out. Let them know it's safe. Caleb lowered the rifle and led Haynes to the cabin. Called down through the cellar door. Luke, you can come up. It's all right. Silence. Then Luke's voice, thin and frightened. They gone? They're gone. And there's someone here I want you to meet. Someone who can help. Slowly, carefully, the children emerged from the cellar. Luke first, then Mara, then Ben clinging to his brother's hand. They stared at Haynes with wide, frightened eyes, seeing the badge and expecting the worst. It's all right, Caleb said gently. This is Tom Haynes. He's a federal marshal, and he's on your side. Haynes crouched down, making himself less intimidating. Hello. Caleb tells me you've been through a hard time. Luke's jaw set stubbornly. We ain't going back. I know, and you don't have to. Haynes looked at each of them in turn. What happened to you at Stillwater? That wasn't right, and I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else, but I need your help. I need you to tell me what they did. Can you do that? The children looked at Caleb, seeking permission or reassurance, or maybe just proof that this wasn't a trick. He nodded slightly. Tom's a good man. You can trust him. It took hours. Hours of careful questions and hesitant answers, of Luke's stilted descriptions and Mara's quiet additions, and Ben's silence that spoke louder than words. Haynes wrote it all down, patient and thorough, building a case that would dismantle Stillwater piece by piece. When they finished, the sun was setting, painting the snow orange and gold. Haynes closed his notebook and looked at Caleb. I'll need to take statements from you too. Official record. Tomorrow. They're exhausted. Fair enough. Haynes stood, stretching stiff muscles. I'll camp down the mountain tonight. Come back in the morning. That work? Works fine. At the door, Haynes paused. You did right, Rourke. Letting them in. Standing your ground. Just did what needed doing. That's what right usually is. Haynes clapped him on the shoulder. Good to see you haven't lost that. After he left, Caleb stood on the porch and watched darkness settle over the mountain. Behind him, he could hear the children moving around the cabin, Mara starting supper, Luke talking quietly to Ben, normal sounds of domestic life. It struck him that his cabin didn't feel empty anymore. Didn't feel like a refuge from the world, but rather like a home with people in it. The thought should have frightened him, should have made him want to retreat back into solitude. Instead, it just felt right. He went inside to help with supper, closing the door against the cold and the darkness, keeping the warmth and the light and the fragile, growing sense of something like family safely inside. The weeks that followed brought a kind of peace Caleb had forgotten existed. Thomas Haynes returned twice more, each time with more questions, building his case against Stillwater with the methodical precision of a man who knew how to dismantle corruption from the inside out. Each visit, the children grew a little less frightened of his badge, a little more willing to speak truth to someone who actually listened. The director kept 2 sets of books, Luke told Haynes during the second visit, his voice steady now, no longer shaking when he talked about what he'd witnessed. One for the inspectors, showing how much food they bought and how many hours we worked. Another one hidden in his office, showing what they really spent and how much they made hiring us out to local farms and businesses. Haynes wrote it down, his weathered face expressionless but his eyes hard. "You saw these books?" I cleaned his office sometimes. He thought I couldn't read well enough to understand what I was looking at. Luke's mouth twisted. "I can read just fine. Ma made sure of it before she died. Smart woman, your mother." "She was." Luke's voice went quiet. "She'd be glad we got out, that somebody finally listened." Mara added details about the kitchen, the impossible quotas, the children who got sick from bad food and weren't allowed to rest. She spoke matter-of-factly about things no child should have to describe, her small hands busy mending one of Caleb's shirts while she talked, needing something to do with the memories. Ben still didn't speak, but he'd started drawing. Caleb had given him paper and a pencil, and the little boy filled page after page with images that told their own story, small figures hunched over washing tubs, stern adults with raised hands, children huddled together in the dark. The drawings were crude but powerful, and Haynes added them to his evidence with gentle reverence. "These matter," he told Ben. "These show what happened when you didn't have words for it. Thank you for sharing them." Ben looked up at him with those huge dark eyes and nodded once, solemn and dignified as a judge. Between Haynes's visits, life on the mountain developed its own rhythm, something steady and predictable that seemed to ease the constant vigilance the children had learned. Caleb taught Luke to shoot, starting with the rifle and working down to the Colt, watching the boy's natural steadiness translate into marksmanship. Luke had good hands and better instincts, never rushing a shot, always breathing through the recoil. "You're a natural," Caleb said after Luke put 3 rounds through the center of a target at 50 yards. "Ever shoot before?" "No, sir, but I watched you. How you breathe, how you squeeze instead of pull. Figured it couldn't be that different from other things that take steady hands." "It's not. A lot of life is just breathing steady and not rushing." Caleb reloaded the rifle, handed it back. "Try again, this time from a standing position, no rest." Luke took the rifle, settled into his stance, and fired. The round hit just left of center, close enough to make Caleb nod approval. "Why are you teaching me this?" Luke asked, lowering the rifle. "Thought you said the danger was past." "Danger's always somewhere. Rather you know how to handle yourself if it comes back around." "You think Blackwell will try again?" "I think men like Blackwell don't give up easy. Legal case or not, he's lost face and money. That makes him dangerous." Caleb took the rifle, checked the action, handed it back. "But mostly I'm teaching you because every man should know how to protect what matters. And you've got people who matter now." Luke looked toward the cabin where Mara was hanging laundry and Ben was playing with one of the barn cats. Something shifted in his face, some burden easing. "Yeah, I guess I do." Mara claimed more territory in the kitchen, experimenting with the dried goods and root vegetables, turning simple ingredients into meals that surprised Caleb with their flavor. She had a gift for it, the same way Luke had a gift with horses, an intuitive understanding that couldn't quite be taught. "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" Caleb asked one evening, tasting stew that somehow made salt pork and potatoes taste like something special. "Ma taught me some. Rest I learned at Stillwater watching the head cook. She was mean, but she knew food." Mara stirred the pot, adjusted the heat. "I figured if I had to work in the kitchen anyway, might as well learn something useful." "It's more than useful. It's a skill, a real one. She flushed with pleasure, trying to hide it by turning back to the stove. It's just cooking. Nothing's just anything when it's done well. That became his approach with all of them, finding what they were good at and building on it, showing them that survival skills could become something more when they had space to breathe and grow. He bought books on his next trip to town, simple readers for Ben, and more advanced texts for Luke and Mara. Set them to studying in the evenings while he read aloud from novels and newspapers, filling the cabin with words and ideas beyond bare survival. Ben surprised him most. The little boy couldn't or wouldn't speak, but he could read. Caleb discovered it by accident when Ben picked up a discarded newspaper and studied it with fierce concentration, his small finger following the words. When Caleb tested him with simple sentences written on paper, Ben read them all, his eyes lighting up with the joy of recognition. "You can read," Caleb said, wonder in his voice. "How long?" Ben held up 4 fingers. 4 years? Since you were a baby?" Ben nodded, then picked up the pencil and wrote in careful letters. "May teached me. Your mother taught you." Caleb felt his throat tighten. She must have been something special. Ben wrote again. "She was nice. Then she went away." "I'm sorry." But Ben shrugged, a gesture too old for his small shoulders, then wrote, "It's okay. I got Luke and Mara." "Yeah, you do. And now you've got me too, if you want." Ben looked at him for a long moment, measuring something. Then he wrote, "Okay." It was the simplest word, but it felt like a contract, a promise, something binding and real. Winter deepened, and the mountain became a white fortress, snow piling high enough that trips to town required the sled and careful timing. Caleb taught the children to read the weather, to understand what different clouds meant, how the wind shifted before a storm, when it was safe to venture out, and when staying put was the only smart choice. "Weather up here will kill you if you don't respect it," he said one morning, watching dark clouds gather to the west. "Always tell someone where you're going and when you'll be back. Always carry matches and tinder, and if you get caught out in a storm, find shelter and wait it out. Better to be late getting home than dead in a drift." "You ever get caught out?" Mara asked. "Once, first winter up here. Thought I knew better than the weather. Storm came up fast and I barely made it to an abandoned trapper's cabin. Spent 3 days there eating snow and jerky, waiting for it to pass." He pointed to a scar on his left hand. "Got frostbite in 2 fingers. Lucky I didn't lose them." Luke studied the scar with interest. "What'd you learn?" That pride's colder than any blizzard, and that surviving's about knowing when to push and when to hold still. They absorbed these lessons the way they absorbed everything. Hungry for knowledge, storing it away against future need, understanding that every skill might mean the difference between life and death. But slowly, gradually, Caleb watched that survival mentality ease. Watched them begin to trust that maybe the future wasn't just about staying alive, but about actually living. It showed in small ways. Mara started singing while she worked. Old songs Caleb half remembered from his childhood. Simple melodies that filled the cabin with something lighter than mere survival. Luke laughed sometimes, usually at something Ben did, the sound rusty at first but growing easier with practice. Ben started leaving his drawings where people could see them instead of hiding them, began sitting closer during evening reading, began trusting that space didn't mean abandonment. One evening in late February, Caleb looked up from the harness he was mending to find all 3 children engaged in their own activities. Luke reading, Mara knitting, Ben drawing, and realized his cabin had become something it never was before. Not just a shelter, not just a refuge, a home. The realization should have terrified him. 7 years he'd lived alone, convinced that solitude was safer, that caring meant hurting, that distance protected everyone involved. But looking at these 3 children who'd stumbled into his life and refused to stumble back out, he found he wasn't frightened at all. He was grateful. The quiet couldn't last forever. Caleb knew that, had known it from the moment he let them stay. Peace was always temporary when you stood between the powerful and what they wanted. So when Haynes arrived in early March with his face set in grim lines, Caleb wasn't surprised. "We've got problems," Haynes said, accepting coffee and warming his hands around the cup. The children had scattered to give the adults privacy, but Caleb could feel them listening from the loft in the back room. "Blackwell?" and friends. He's filed a complaint with the territorial governor claiming I exceeded my authority, says I destroyed legal documents without due process, that I'm harboring kidnappers and interfering with legitimate business. Haynes took a long swallow of coffee. He's got support too. Seems Stillwater has contracts with half the territory's wealthiest families, providing cheap labor for their businesses. They don't want those contracts questioned. Caleb felt cold settle in his stomach. What's that mean for the children? Means we've got to fight. The governor's appointed a territorial judge to review the case. Judge Harlan Pierce, decent man mostly, but he follows the letter of the law pretty close. If those custody contracts are legal, he'll enforce them regardless of what happened at Stillwater. The contracts are based on fraud and abuse, which we'll have to prove. In court, with the children testifying. Haynes set down his cup. Caleb, I need to be straight with you. This won't be easy. Blackwell will have lawyers, will paint those kids as liars and troublemakers. He'll make it seem like Stillwater's a charity being attacked by ungrateful wards. And the judge will be under pressure from powerful people who want this to go away quiet. So we don't let it go away quiet. No, we make noise. We bring in every witness we can find, former workers, families who lost children, anyone who knows what really happened. We document everything, and we trust that the truth matters more than money. Caleb heard the doubt under Haynes's confidence. You don't think we'll win? I think we've got a chance. Better than even odds if we do this right. But I won't lie to you. There's a real possibility the judge sides with Blackwell. And if that happens, those children go back. No. Caleb, I said no. I won't let that happen. Haynes studied him with eyes that had seen men make stands over principles and usually die for it. What are you saying? I'm saying if the law fails them, then the law's failed, and I won't be bound by it. You're talking about running, taking them somewhere the territorial courts can't reach. If that's what it takes. That's kidnapping, federal crime. You'd be a wanted man for the rest of your life. Then I'd be wanted. Caleb met his old friend's gaze without flinching. Tom, I let them in. I promised they'd be safe. I'm not breaking that promise because some judge thinks legal contracts matter more than broken children. Haynes was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed, and it sounded like surrender and respect all mixed together. You always were stubborn as a mule. Fine. We do this legal first. We build the strongest case we can. We fight it in court, and we trust the system. But if the system fails, he paused. If it fails, you give me a day's head start before you run. That's all I ask. So I can honestly say, I didn't know where you went. Deal. They shook on it. Two men who'd ridden together years ago, bound by something deeper than law or duty, bound by the understanding that sometimes the right thing was also the hardest thing, and you did it anyway. After Haynes left, Caleb called the children down from their hiding places. They came slowly, reading the tension in his shoulders, the set of his jaw. You heard, he said. Not a question. Luke nodded. We have to go to court. Yes. And if we lose, we go back to Stillwater. No. If you lose in court, we leave, all of us. We go somewhere the territorial government can't touch you, and we start over. Mara's eyes went wide. But that's against the law. You'd be a criminal. Wouldn't be the first time I broke a law I didn't believe in. You'd do that for us? Luke's voice cracked. Risk everything? Caleb looked at each of them in turn. Luke trying so hard to be strong, Mara with tears starting in her eyes, Ben watching with that solemn, unblinking gaze. You're not just strays I took in for a season. You're mine now. Mine to protect. And I don't quit on what's mine. Ben crossed the room and wrapped his arms around Caleb's waist, holding tight. Mara followed, and then Luke, and suddenly Caleb had 3 children clinging to him like he was the only solid thing in a shifting world. Maybe he was. We're going to fight this legal first, he said, his voice rough. We're going to tell the truth and trust it matters. But whatever happens, we stay together. That's the promise. That's what you can count on. Together, Luke echoed. Together, Mara whispered. Ben just held on tighter. The preparation for trial consumed the next month. Haynes brought a lawyer from Helena, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Fletcher, who listened to the children's stories with the same careful attention Haynes had shown, taking notes and asking questions that never felt like accusations. The key is making the judge see you as children, not property, she explained during one of her visits. Blackwell will try to paint you as ungrateful, rebellious, even criminal. We counter that by showing your humanity, your intelligence. The fact that you're sitting here, healthy and learning, proves that what you needed wasn't harsh discipline, but basic care. What if he asks about running? Luke wanted to know. About stealing food from that farm? You tell the truth. You say you were starving, desperate, and you took what you needed to survive. Then you let me establish that children shouldn't have to steal food to survive, that the institution responsible for feeding you failed in that duty. Fletcher smiled, and it had teeth. We're not defending your right to steal. We're attacking the conditions that made stealing necessary. She was good at her work, methodical and fierce, building their case piece by piece. She interviewed former Stillwater workers who'd quit rather than continue participating in the abuse. She documented injuries, collected medical testimony about Ben's burned hands and the scars on Luke's back from beatings. She built a timeline of complaints ignored, inspections falsified, children who disappeared into the system and never emerged. This is bigger than just you three, she told them. This is about dozens of children, maybe hundreds, who've been ground down by a system that profits from their suffering. If we win, we don't just free you, we shut Stillwater down permanently. The weight of that responsibility showed in the children's faces, but they didn't flinch from it. They'd lived it. They knew what was at stake. Caleb watched them grow stronger as the trial date approached, watched them rehearse their testimony with Fletcher, practicing how to stay calm under hostile questioning, how to tell their stories without breaking down. They were brave in ways that humbled him, these three who'd already endured more than most adults faced in a lifetime. But he also saw the fear they tried to hide, saw Luke's nightmares increase, heard him pacing at night when he should have been sleeping, saw Mara's hand shake sometimes when she thought no one was watching, saw Ben retreat into silence even deeper than usual, his drawings growing darker, full of shadows and closed doors. One evening, Caleb found Luke on the porch, staring out at the mountain darkness, with tension radiating from his young shoulders. "Can't sleep?" Caleb asked, settling onto the bench beside him. "Keep thinking about the trial, about having to see him again." "Blackwell." "Yeah." Luke's hands clenched into fists. "He used to come through the dormitories at night sometimes, checking on us," he said, "making sure we were where we were supposed to be, but really, he just liked seeing us scared. Liked knowing he had that power." "He doesn't have power over you anymore." "Feels like he does. Feels like he's still controlling everything, even from a distance." Luke's voice dropped. What if the judge sides with him? What if all this, the preparing, the testimony, the hope, what if it's for nothing? Caleb chose his words carefully. "Then we've still done right. We've stood up, we've told the truth, and we've shown that some people care enough to fight. That matters, even if we lose. But we'd still have to run." "Yes." "Where would we even go?" "West, probably. California, maybe, or Oregon. Somewhere far enough that territorial warrants don't reach. We'd change our names, start fresh. It wouldn't be easy." Luke was quiet, processing this. Then, "Would you really do it? Give up everything, your home, your name, your whole life, just for us?" Caleb looked at the boy beside him, this child who'd been forced to become a man too soon, who'd protected his siblings with nothing but determination and love. "Luke, this place was just a place before you three showed up, just logs and dirt and loneliness. You made it a home, made it matter. So yeah, I'd give it up. I'd give it without hesitation. Because what you gave me is worth more than any piece of land." Luke's throat worked, swallowing hard. "I don't know what we did to deserve you. You survived. You protected your family. You had the courage to ask for help when you needed it. That's everything, son. That's more than most people manage their whole lives." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one above the mountain peaks. Finally, Luke said, "Whatever happens at trial, whatever we have to do after, I'm glad we knocked on your door that night. So am I." The trial was set for the first week of April, to be held in Helena at the territorial courthouse. Haynes arranged for them to travel together, a small caravan of witnesses and lawyers, everyone understanding that this case would set precedent far beyond three children's fate. The night before they left, Caleb gathered the children in the cabin's main room. "I want to be clear about something. No matter what happens in that courtroom, no matter what the judge decides, you three did nothing wrong. You survived terrible circumstances. You protected each other. You found the courage to run and the wisdom to ask for help. That makes you stronger and braver than most adults I've known. But we might still lose, Mara said quietly. We might. The world isn't always fair. Good people lose sometimes, and bad people win. But losing a legal case doesn't mean you were wrong. It just means the system failed, and if it fails, we'll find another way. Ben tugged at his sleeve, held up his drawing pad. He'd sketched 4 figures standing together on a mountain, facing the sunrise. The details were simple, but the meaning clear. Family, unity, hope. Yeah, Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. That's exactly right. We face it together. They left at dawn, taking the wagon down the mountain and joining Haynes's group on the main road to Helena. The journey took 3 days, camping at night under stars that seemed impossibly distant and cold. The children huddled close to the fire, drawing strength from proximity, while the adults discussed strategy in low voices. Helena sprawled across the valley like a promise and a threat, its streets busy with commerce and politics, the territorial courthouse rising above the other buildings like a judge's gavel frozen in stone. Haynes had arranged rooms at a boarding house, clean and comfortable, but the children barely noticed their surroundings. Their attention was fixed on the courthouse, on the battle that waited there. The trial began on a Monday morning, the courtroom packed with spectators drawn by rumor and scandal. Blackwell sat at the plaintiff's table with 3 lawyers looking confident and righteous. The children sat with Caleb and Fletcher, small and vulnerable but determined. Judge Harlan Pierce took the bench, a weathered man in his 60s with sharp eyes and a face that gave nothing away. He surveyed the courtroom, establishing order with just his presence, then nodded to the lawyers. This court is convened to hear the matter of Stillwater Institution versus federal oversight, specifically regarding the custody of 3 minor children. Counselors, your opening statements. Blackwell's lead lawyer stood, a smooth-talking man named Garrison who knew how to play to the crowd. Your Honor, this case is quite simple. Stillwater Institution provides shelter, food, education, and moral guidance to orphaned children who would otherwise starve on the streets. These 3 children, he gestured dismissively toward Luke, Mara, and Ben, were taken in, cared for, and given opportunities they never would have had otherwise. In return, they were asked to contribute to the institution through reasonable labor, as is customary and legal in such arrangements. When they chose to run rather than accept legitimate discipline, the institution sought their return according to legally binding custody contracts. Instead, they were harbored by a civilian who had no legal authority to keep them, and their return was blocked by federal interference exceeding proper jurisdiction. We ask this court to enforce the contracts, return the children to Stillwater's care, and censure those who unlawfully interfered. He sat down, satisfied, and Caleb felt his jaw clench. The man had made it sound so reasonable, so legal, completely stripping away the humanity of what had actually happened. Fletcher stood, and her voice cut through the courtroom's murmur like a blade. Your Honor, Mr. Garrison is correct that this case is simple, but not in the way he suggests. This is a case about the difference between law and justice, about whether legal contracts can justify child abuse, about whether institutions designed to protect vulnerable children can profit from their suffering without consequence. She turned to look directly at the judge. Stillwater Institution systematically abused the children in its care. It worked them beyond their capacity, fed them inadequately, housed them in dangerous conditions, and punished them brutally when they complained. The custody contracts Mr. Garrison references were obtained through fraud, listing terms of care that were never met. This court must decide whether technical legality matters more than the children's actual welfare. We trust you'll choose justice. The battle was joined. Over the next 3 days, the courtroom became a battleground for truth. Blackwell's lawyers paraded witnesses who testified to Stillwater's charitable work, its contributions to the community, its proper procedures and adequate facilities. They made it sound like a haven, a place of opportunity and growth. Then Fletcher brought her witnesses. Former workers who described the reality behind Stillwater's facade. Children working 12-hour days, inadequate food, medical care denied, beatings for minor infractions. A doctor who examined Ben's hands and testified that the scarring was consistent with repeated burns from industrial equipment. A teacher who'd quit after being ordered to falsify education records, showing children receiving instruction they'd never actually gotten. Each testimony chipped away at Blackwell's version of events, revealing the ugly truth beneath the legal veneer. On the fourth day, the children testified. Luke went first, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. He described the work, the conditions, the fear. Described watching smaller children break under the weight of impossible expectations. Described the day Ben burned his hands and kept working because stopping meant punishment worse than the pain. Garrison tried to shake him on cross-examination, suggesting he was lying, that he'd misunderstood discipline for abuse, that his bitterness colored his memory. But Luke didn't break. He met each accusation with calm truth, never raising his voice, never losing control. "Did you or did you not steal from Stillwater when you ran?" Garrison demanded. "We took food." "Yes, sir." "So you're a thief?" "I'm a brother who kept his family alive. If that makes me a thief, then yes, sir, I'm a thief." "And you expect this court to reward your criminal behavior?" Luke looked at the judge, then back at Garrison. "I expect this court to understand that children shouldn't have to steal food to survive. That if we were hungry enough to risk running in winter with nothing, then maybe the place we ran from was worse than dying. That's what I expect, sir." Understanding. The courtroom went silent. Even Garrison seemed momentarily at a loss. Mara testified next, describing the kitchen work, the impossible quotas, the children who got sick from spoiled food and weren't allowed to rest. She spoke quietly but clearly, her small voice carrying weight beyond her years. "They told us we should be grateful," she said, "that orphans like us didn't deserve better. That we were lucky to have work and a roof, but I don't think lucky is the right word for being so tired you fall asleep standing up, or so hungry you eat things you find in the trash, or so scared all the time that you can't remember what it feels like not to be scared." Ben didn't testify verbally, couldn't or wouldn't speak, but Fletcher entered his drawings into evidence, laying them out one by one for the judge to see. Images of children hunched and broken, adults looming with raised hands, doors locked from the outside. Pictures that needed no words to convey their meaning. Judge Pierce studied each drawing in silence, his weathered face unreadable, but his eyes sharp and focused. When he reached the last one, Ben's picture of 4 figures on a mountain, facing the sunrise, he paused for a long moment. "This last image," he said, "when was it drawn?" Fletcher checked her notes. 2 weeks ago, Your Honor, after the child learned he would have to testify." "And what does it represent?" Ben stood up from his seat, walked to the judge's bench with the careful dignity of someone older than his years. He took a pencil from Fletcher's table and wrote on a blank piece of paper, then handed it to Judge Pierce. The judge read it aloud. "Family, hope, home." He looked down at Ben, really looked at him, seen past the case number and custody contracts to the small boy who'd survived horrors and still believed in sunrise. "Thank you, son," he said gently. "You may sit down." The trial concluded that afternoon. Both sides made their closing arguments, Garrison insisting on the legality of Stillwater's contracts, Fletcher arguing that legality without morality was just tyranny in disguise. Judge Pierce listened to it all without expression, then adjourned to consider his ruling. "I'll have a decision by tomorrow morning," he said. "Court is dismissed." They filed out into the fading daylight, exhausted and wrung out. The children were quiet, drained by the ordeal of reliving trauma in front of strangers. Caleb gathered them close as they walked back to the boarding house, providing shelter with his presence. "You did good," he told them, "all 3 of you. You told the truth, and you did it with courage. That's all anyone could ask." "Will it be enough?" Mara whispered. "I don't know, honey. I hope so. But whatever the judge decides, we'll face it together." That night, Caleb sat awake long after the children finally slept. He thought about tomorrow's ruling, about the 2 paths stretching out from it, one that kept them in Montana, legal and recognized, the other that sent them running into exile and uncertainty. Either way, he'd meant what he said. They'd face it together. He just hoped the law would prove worthy of their faith. Dawn came too soon, and not soon enough. Caleb had watched the darkness fade to gray through the boarding house window, his mind running through contingencies he'd already planned 100 times. Beside him on the narrow bed, Ben slept curled against his side, small fingers clutching Caleb's shirt even in sleep. Across the room, Luke and Mara shared the other bed, both awake and silent, staring at the ceiling with the weight of waiting pressing down on them. "We should get ready," Luke said finally, his voice rough from a sleepless night. They dressed in the clothes Fletcher had bought for court, simple but clean, proper enough to show respect without trying to hide what they were. Luke helped Ben with his buttons, patient and gentle, while Mara plaited her hair with fingers that trembled slightly. Caleb watched them prepare to face judgment and felt his heart clench with something between pride and fury. They shouldn't have to do this. Shouldn't have to stand in front of strangers and beg for the basic right to be safe, to be children, to be free from the machinery that had tried to grind them down. But the world didn't care about should, only about what was. And what was demanded, they walk into that courtroom and wait for a judge to decide their fate. Fletcher met them in the lobby, looking sharp despite her own sleepless night. "The judge sent word he'll deliver his ruling at 9 o'clock. That gives us 30 minutes. "Any indication which way he's leaning?" Caleb asked. "None. Pierce plays his cards close. Could go either way." She looked at the children, her expression softening. "How are you three holding up?" "We're ready," Luke said, though his face was pale. "Good. Remember what I told you. No matter what happens in there, you keep your composure. No outbursts, no matter how you feel. The judge needs to see you as mature, thoughtful people worthy of making choices about your own lives." Ben tugged at her sleeve and held up his drawing pad. He'd sketched a new picture overnight, a courtroom with scales of justice, but instead of being balanced, one side held children and the other held money. The side with money hung lower, outweighing the children. Fletcher studied it, her jaw tightening. "That's exactly the fight we're in, isn't it? Let's hope Judge Pierce sees it the same way." They walked to the courthouse through streets already busy with morning commerce. Word had spread about the trial, and a crowd gathered outside the building, some supportive, holding signs about children's welfare, others hostile, calling them liars and troublemakers. Caleb kept the children close, shielding them from the worst of it, but he couldn't block out everything. "Ungrateful wretches!" someone shouted. "Stillwater saved you from the streets!" "Blackwell's a good Christian man," another voice called. "Provides honest work for orphans who'd otherwise starve." But other voices rose in response. "Let the children speak. Justice for the abused. Shut down Stillwater." Haynes met them at the courthouse doors, his federal badge clearing a path through the crowd. "Ignore them," he said quietly. "They don't know what they're talking about. Just noise and ignorance." Inside, the courtroom filled quickly, spectators packing the gallery, journalists taking notes, lawyers arranging papers with nervous energy. Blackwell sat at his table looking confident, flanked by Garrison and his team. When his eyes met Caleb's across the room, something cold and victorious flickered in them. Caleb felt ice settle in his gut. Blackwell thought he'd won. Judge Pierce entered precisely at 9, his face carved from granite, revealing nothing. The bailiff called for order, and the courtroom fell silent except for the sound of shuffling feet and nervous breathing. "I've considered all testimony and evidence presented in this matter," Pierce began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I've reviewed the custody contracts, the institutional records, the medical reports, and the statements from both current and former staff. I've examined the drawings provided by the youngest child, and I've listened carefully to the testimony of all 3 children involved." He paused, and in that silence Caleb heard his own heart hammering. This case presents a fundamental question. Can legal contracts justify the mistreatment of children? Can institutions designed to protect the vulnerable instead exploit them, hiding behind the veneer of charity and legal authority? Pierce's eyes swept the courtroom. The answer, under both territorial and federal law, is no. Contracts obtained through fraud or enforced through abuse are void. Institutions that violate their duty of care forfeit their authority. Relief started to bloom in Caleb's chest, but Pierce wasn't finished. However, this court must also consider the proper jurisdiction for such matters. The federal marshal acted on concerns for the children's immediate safety, which was appropriate. But the question of permanent custody falls under territorial law, not federal oversight. Therefore, While I find the evidence of abuse credible and disturbing, I cannot simply void the contracts without proper territorial review." The relief died. Caleb felt the children tense beside him, sensed their hope crumbling. "That said," Pierce continued, and his voice hardened, "I am immediately suspending Stillwater Institution's custody of these 3 children pending a full territorial investigation into allegations of systemic abuse. During this suspension, temporary custody will be granted to—" He looked directly at Caleb. "Caleb Rourke, who has demonstrated both capability and genuine care for the children's welfare. This temporary arrangement will remain in effect until the investigation concludes and permanent custody can be determined through proper legal channels." The courtroom erupted. Blackwell surged to his feet, Garrison shouting objections, supporters on both sides yelling their approval or outrage. Pierce's gavel cracked like thunder. "Order! I will have order in this court." When silence finally fell, he continued, "Furthermore, I am ordering an immediate inspection of Stillwater Institution by territorial authorities, with federal oversight to ensure impartiality. All current residents are to be interviewed independently, all records are to be seized and reviewed, and the institution is hereby forbidden from accepting new wards or releasing current ones until the investigation concludes. Director Blackwell, you are to surrender all custody documents and financial records to Marshal Haynes within 24 hours. Failure to comply will result in contempt charges and possible criminal prosecution." Blackwell's face had gone purple with rage. "This is an outrage. You're destroying a charitable institution based on the lies of 3 ungrateful—" "Director Blackwell, you will address this court with respect or you will be removed. The children's testimony was consistent, detailed, and corroborated by multiple witnesses, including your own former employees. Their credibility far exceeds your denials." Pierce's gaze could have cut steel. "If the investigation reveals what I suspect it will, you'll face charges far more serious than contempt. This court is adjourned." The gavel fell one final time and chaos descended. Caleb pulled the children close as the crowd surged around them, some shouting congratulations, others hurling accusations. Haynes and Fletcher formed a protective barrier, pushing through to the doors while journalists shouted questions, and Blackwell's supporters screamed about federal overreach and religious persecution. They made it outside, into the sharp morning air, and Caleb finally let himself breathe. The children clung to him, shaking with relief and exhaustion, and the aftermath of fear finally releasing its grip. "We won," Morrow whispered. "We actually won." "Not won," Fletcher corrected gently. "But we survived to fight another day. The temporary custody is a victory, and the investigation gives us leverage. If it finds what we know it will, the permanent custody will follow." "How long will the investigation take?" Luke asked. "Months, probably. Maybe longer. Territorial bureaucracy moves slow." She looked at Caleb. "Think you can handle 3 children for that long?" "I've managed this long. Figure I can manage longer." Haynes joined them, his face grim despite the partial victory. "Blackwell's not taking this well. He's already talking about appeals, about political pressure. The man has friends in high places, and he's going to use every connection he's got." "Let him try," Caleb said. "We've got the law on our side now, at least temporarily, and we've got the truth." "Truth doesn't always win against money and influence." "Maybe not, but it's what we've got to work with." They returned to the boarding house to gather their things, planning to leave Helena that afternoon before Blackwell could organize any kind of response. But as they packed, a knock came at the door, sharp and official. Caleb opened it to find a young man in a clerk's uniform holding an envelope. "Message for Mr. Caleb Rourke, from Judge Pierce." Caleb took it, tipped the clerk, and closed the door. The children gathered around as he broke the seal and read the single page inside. His eyebrows rose. "What is it?" Luke asked. "Judge Pierce wants to see us in his chambers, says it's important and unofficial." Caleb checked his pocket watch. "We've got an hour." They arrived at the courthouse chambers as directed, finding Judge Pierce in shirt sleeves, his formal robes hung on a hook behind his desk. He looked older without the trappings of office, more human, the lines in his face deeper. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing to chairs. "Please sit. This won't take long." They settled uneasily, uncertain what this meeting meant. Pierce studied them for a moment, then spoke directly to the children. I want you to understand something. What I did in court today, the temporary custody, the investigation, that was the extent of what the law allows me to do right now. But between us, in this room, I can speak more freely. He leaned forward. I believe you. Everything you said about Stillwater, about the abuse and exploitation, I believe it. I've heard rumors about that place for years, but nobody would speak against it. The director has too much influence, too many powerful friends, until you three had the courage to stand up and tell your story. Then why not just void the contracts completely? Luke asked. Why make us wait for an investigation? Because I have to follow the law, even when I disagree with it. The territorial statutes require due process for dissolving custody agreements. If I'd simply voided them without proper procedure, Blackwell would appeal, and a higher court would overturn my decision on technical grounds. Then you'd be right back where you started, only worse because he'd know the system would protect him. Pierce's voice was firm but kind. The way I did it, temporary suspension with investigation, that's harder to challenge. It gives us time to build an airtight case for permanent dissolution. How much time? Caleb asked. 6 months, minimum. Maybe a year. The territorial government will drag their feet. Too many wealthy donors have interests in keeping Stillwater open. But federal oversight means they can't bury it completely. Eventually, the truth will come out. And in the meantime, those children stay with you under my order. Blackwell can't touch them. And if the investigation finds what I expect it will, we'll have grounds to not only dissolve their contracts, but shut down Stillwater permanently and charge Blackwell with criminal abuse. Pierce stood, moved to the window. I know waiting is hard, but sometimes the law moves slow because it has to move right. Can you be patient a while longer? The children looked at each other, that silent communication passing between them. Then Luke spoke for all three. We've been patient for years, sir. We can manage a few months more, long as we know we're safe. You're safe. You have my word and the law's protection. Mr. Rourke has temporary custody, which means you're under his care and authority. If anyone tries to remove you from his custody without a court order, they'll answer to me and to Marshal Haynes. Ben pulled out his drawing pad and sketched quickly. A figure in robes with scales, but this time the scales were balanced, children on one side and justice on the other, perfectly level. He showed it to Pierce. The judge studied it, and something in his weathered face softened. That's the goal, son. That's what I'm trying to achieve. Thank you for reminding me why it matters. They left the chambers with something they hadn't had before. Not just hope, but confirmation that the system, however slowly, was working in their favor. The ride back to the mountain felt different from the anxious journey down, lighter somehow, despite the long months of waiting ahead. The mountain welcomed them home with clean air and silence, the cabin exactly as they'd left it, the horses nickering recognition in the barn. Caleb watched the children scatter to their familiar routines. Luke to the horses, Mara to the kitchen, Ben to his corner by the fire with his drawings, and felt the rightness of it settle in his bones. This was home now. Not just for him, but for all of them. The weeks that followed brought a new rhythm, one marked by the knowledge that they had time, that the immediate danger had passed, even if permanent resolution remained distant. Caleb threw himself into making the cabin more suitable for long-term occupancy by 4 people instead of 1 reclusive man. He built a proper bedroom in the loft for Luke, partitioned off a corner of the main room for Mara, fashioned a small bed for Ben near the fireplace where the little boy felt safest. Luke helped with the construction, learning carpentry with the same quick aptitude he showed for everything. His hands, already skilled with horses and guns, adapted easily to hammer and saw, measuring and cutting with careful precision. "You're a natural builder," Caleb observed, watching Luke fit boards together with barely a gap between them. "Just makes sense," Luke said. "Everything's got a logic to it. How the pieces fit, how the weight distributes. It's like solving a puzzle. You ever think about what you want to do when you're grown, after all this is settled?" Luke paused, considering. "Used to think I just wanted to survive long enough to keep Ben and Mara safe. Didn't think past that. But lately," he ran his hand along the smooth board he'd just planed. "Lately I've been thinking maybe I could build things, houses, barns, furniture. Make things that last, that give people shelter and comfort. Seems like good work. It is good work. Honest work. Building something from nothing, making it solid and true. There's satisfaction in that. You ever wish you'd done something different, instead of being a lawman, I mean? Caleb thought about those years behind a badge, the good he'd tried to do, and the compromises he'd had to make. The day he'd finally decided the cost was too high. I don't regret the law. Taught me a lot about people, about justice, about the difference between what's legal and what's right. But I don't miss it either. This, he gestured at the cabin, the mountain, the life they were building. This feels more true than anything I did wearing a badge. Luke nodded slowly, understanding something unspoken in those words. They worked in companionable silence, the rhythm of construction filling the space where conversation had been. Mara transformed the kitchen into something remarkable, organizing supplies with meticulous care, experimenting with recipes using the limited ingredients available. She started a small garden as soon as the ground thawed enough, planting seeds with reverent attention, nurturing them like they were precious beyond measure. "These tomatoes will be ready by late summer," she told Caleb, her hands gentle on the fragile seedlings. "And the beans should come in earlier. I planted them close to the cabin wall where they'll get morning sun, but afternoon shade. That's how Ma used to do it." "Your mother taught you gardening?" "Taught me everything she could before she died. How to grow food, preserve it, make it stretch when there wasn't enough. She said a woman who could feed her family would never be helpless, no matter what else happened." Mara's voice went soft. "I think about her sometimes. Wonder what she'd think of all this, of us ending up here. I think she'd be proud. You kept your family together against impossible odds. That takes strength. I didn't do it alone. Luke did most of the protecting. And you did most of the caring. Both matter equally." She looked up at him, dirt on her hands and hope in her eyes. "You really think we'll get to stay? That the investigation will go our way? I think the truth has a way of coming out, especially when good people are willing to fight for it. And we've got good people on our side, Fletcher, Haynes, Judge Pierce. We've got a chance, maybe better than even. But not certain. Nothing's certain. But we don't need certain. We just need possible, and we work with what we've got." Ben remained mostly silent, but his communication through drawings and written words grew more sophisticated. He discovered books in Caleb's small collection, devouring them with hungry focus, and started writing his own stories, simple tales about children who found safety, families who stayed together, homes that couldn't be taken away. One evening, Caleb found him writing by lamplight, his small face serious with concentration. "What are you working on?" Ben showed him the page, covered in careful script, "The Boy Who Found His Voice." "Is this your story?" Ben shook his head, then nodded, then shrugged, yes and no, and maybe all at once. He wrote more. "It's about a boy who stops talking because words get him hurt. Then he finds people who listen, and words become safe again." Caleb felt his throat tighten. "That's a good story, important story. You should finish it." "Will you read it when I'm done?" "I'd be honored." Ben smiled, rare and precious, and returned to his writing. Caleb watched him work. This child who'd been hurt so badly, he'd locked his voice away but was slowly, carefully, learning to trust again. The healing wasn't linear. There were still nightmares, still days when Ben couldn't bear to be touched or looked at, still moments when fear overwhelmed everything else. But the trajectory was clear, pointing towards something better, something whole. Reports from Helena arrived regularly through Haynes, updates on the investigation's progress. The news was mixed. Territorial authorities were indeed dragging their feet, but federal oversight kept the pressure on. Interviews with current and former Stillwater residents revealed patterns of abuse consistent with what Luke, Mara, and Ben had described. Financial records showed discrepancies between reported expenditures and actual spending, money that should have gone to children's care instead lining Blackwell's pockets. "It's building," Haynes said during one visit. "Slow, but building. Blackwell's trying to discredit witnesses, claiming they're disgruntled former employees with grudges or children coached to lie. But there's too many of them, and their stories align too well. Eventually, the weight of evidence will be undeniable." "Eventually," Caleb repeated. "How long is eventually?" "Pierce thinks the investigation will conclude by fall. Then there'll be hearings, formal dissolution of contracts, criminal charges if the evidence supports it. You're looking at this being fully resolved by year's end, maybe sooner if Blackwell's support collapses. That's a long time for children to live in uncertainty. I know, but it's the best we can do within the system. Unless you want to take the other option, no, we committed to doing this legal. We'll see it through. Caleb glanced toward where the children were working on their various projects. They're stronger than they know. They'll manage. But managing wasn't the same as thriving, and Caleb saw the toll uncertainty took. Luke grew more protective, hovering over his siblings with barely concealed anxiety. Mara threw herself into work, cooking and cleaning and gardening with an intensity that spoke of displacement activity, staying busy to avoid thinking. Ben's nightmares increased, the old fears creeping back in the dark hours before dawn. Caleb did what he could, maintained routine, offered stability, reminded them daily that they were safe and wanted. But he couldn't erase the fundamental precariousness of their situation, the knowledge that their future still hung on decisions made by people far away, in rooms they'd never see, for reasons that might have nothing to do with what was right. Summer arrived with warmth that eased some of the tension, long days perfect for working outside, and short nights that left less time for worry. They fell into patterns that felt almost normal: morning chores, afternoon lessons, evening reading by lamplight. Caleb taught them everything he knew about surviving on the mountain, about reading weather and tracking game, about when to push forward and when to hold still. But he also taught them softer things, taught Luke to play checkers and lose gracefully, taught Mara to recognize edible plants and which flowers were just pretty versus which had purpose, taught Ben that silence could be companionable instead of fearful, that sometimes the best communication was just being present together. One evening in late July, they sat on the porch watching sunset paint the peaks gold and crimson. Ben leaned against Caleb's side, Mara sat on the steps with her garden journal, and Luke whittled a piece of pine into something that might become a bird. "This is nice," Mara said quietly. "Just sitting, being together, not having to worry about quotas or punishments or someone deciding we're not working hard enough." "This is how it should be," Caleb replied. "Children should have time to just be children, to sit and watch sunsets and think about nothing more pressing than what's for supper. You think we'll get to keep this? After everything's decided? I think we'll fight like hell to keep it. And I think we've got truth and law and stubbornness on our side. That's a powerful combination." Luke looked up from his whittling. "What happens if we lose? I know you said we'd run, but where would we even go? How would we live?" Caleb had thought about this extensively, planned it down to the smallest detail. "West, California or Oregon territory. I've got savings, enough to get us started somewhere new. We'd change our names, find a town that needs a carpenter and a cook and a man who can handle horses. Start fresh where nobody knows our history." "You've really thought it through." "I told you, I don't quit on what's mine. That means having contingencies, being ready for anything." He met Luke's eyes. "But I don't think it'll come to that. I think the truth's going to win this time." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've seen what lies look like, and I've seen what truth looks like. Lies are slippery. They change depending on who's listening. They contradict themselves. They fall apart under scrutiny. Truth is solid. It doesn't shift or change. Your truth about Stillwater, about what happened there, it's been consistent from the first night you showed up on my porch. That kind of consistency is hard to fake and harder to ignore." Ben tugged at his sleeve, held up his writing pad. "Do you promise we stay together?" "I promise. No matter what happens, no matter where we end up, we stay together. That's not negotiable." The little boy studied his face, searching for doubt or deception and finding none. Then he wrapped his arms around Caleb's middle and held tight, trust and need and hope all bundled in that small, fierce embrace. Caleb held him back, looking out at the mountain that had been his refuge and was now his responsibility. 7 months ago, he'd been alone, convinced that solitude was safety, that caring meant hurting. Now he had 3 children depending on him, a legal battle hanging over their heads, and a future uncertain enough to keep him awake some nights. He wouldn't trade it for anything. August brought news that shifted everything. Haynes arrived unannounced, his face grim with purpose, and Caleb knew immediately something significant had happened. Blackwell's arrested, Haynes said without preamble. Federal charges, fraud, embezzlement, child endangerment. The investigation found he was billing the territory for twice as many children as he actually housed, pocketing the difference. Found evidence of selling children's labor to businesses and keeping the wages. Found medical records he'd falsified to hide injuries. The man kept everything documented, probably never thought anyone would look. Caleb felt something unclench in his chest. What does this mean for the children? Means the contracts are void. All of them. Can't enforce custody agreements with a man facing 20 years in federal prison. Judge Pierce is expediting the permanent custody hearings, wants them resolved before fall. Haynes smiled, tired but genuine. Caleb, you're going to get those kids, legal and permanent. It's done. The children had been listening from the doorway, and at Haynes's words they erupted. Mara crying, Luke laughing with relief, Ben running to Caleb and jumping into his arms with uncharacteristic exuberance. Caleb caught him, held him close, and felt the weight of 7 months of uncertainty finally lift. When? He managed to ask. Hearings set for September 15th. Formality mostly. Pierce already indicated he's granting permanent custody. You'll need to officially adopt them, which means paperwork and a formal court appearance. But there's no opposition now. No one left to fight it. What about the other children at Stillwater? Being placed in legitimate orphanages and foster homes, one's actually inspected and regulated. Some are going to family members who didn't know they were there. The whole operation's being dismantled piece by piece. Haynes accepted the coffee Mara pressed into his hands. You three broke it open. Every child that gets placed somewhere safe, that's because you had the courage to speak up. Luke's voice was unsteady. How many? 47 children total, most under 12. All of them showing signs of malnutrition and overwork, some with injuries never treated. They're getting medical care now, proper placement, a chance at real childhood. Haynes looked at him directly. You saved them, son. All of them. The weight of that settled over the cabin like snow, soft and profound and transformative. 47 children. 47 lives changed because 3 had refused to stay silent. That night, Caleb lay in his loft and listened to the children talking below, their voices lighter than he'd ever heard them. They were planning, talking about school, about what they wanted to learn, about the future that was finally, incredibly, within reach. Ben's voice rose above the others, high and clear and unmistakable. I want to learn to really play the harmonica, he said, the first words he'd spoken aloud in over a year. So I can make music instead of just noise. Caleb closed his eyes and let the sound of that voice wash over him, precious beyond measure. The child who'd been hurt into silence had found his voice again. The broken pieces were coming back together, not perfectly, never perfectly, but whole enough to function, to heal, to grow. September 15th dawned clear and cold, autumn already touching the high peaks with gold. They dressed in their court clothes one final time and made the journey to Helena, but this time anticipation replaced dread. Hope instead of fear. The courtroom was nearly empty, just them, Fletcher, Haynes, and a handful of observers. Judge Pierce took the bench with the same grave dignity he'd shown before, but when he looked at the children, Caleb saw warmth in those weathered eyes. We're here to formalize the custody arrangement for Luke, Mara, and Benjamin, Pierce began. The temporary custody granted to Caleb Rourke has proven successful. All reports indicate the children are healthy, happy, and thriving in his care. The contracts previously binding them to Stillwater Institution have been voided due to Director Blackwell's criminal conduct. Therefore, this court is prepared to grant permanent custody and approve formal adoption proceedings. Mr. Rourke, do you accept full legal responsibility for these 3 children? Caleb stood. I do, Your Honor. Do you understand this is a permanent commitment? That you will be responsible for their welfare, education, and care until they reach majority? I understand, and I accept it gladly. Pierce turned to the children. Luke, Mara, Benjamin, do you consent to this adoption, to becoming permanent members of Mr. Rourke's family? They stood together, and Luke spoke for all 3, his voice clear and certain. We do, Your Honor. He's already family. This just makes it official. Then, by the authority vested in me by the Montana Territory, I grant permanent custody of Luke, Mara, and Benjamin to Caleb Rourke and approve the formal adoption. These children are now legally and permanently members of the Rourke family, with all rights and protections that entails. Pierce's gavel fell one final time, and this time it sounded like freedom. Congratulations, this court is adjourned. Fletcher was crying as she hugged each of them. Haynes shook Caleb's hand with bruising force. Ben launched himself at Caleb with enough momentum to nearly knock him down, and Caleb caught him, held him, felt Mara and Luke pile on until they were all tangled together, laughing and crying and whole. They were a family, not by blood, not by traditional paths, but by choice and sacrifice and love that had grown from desperate circumstances into something permanent and real. The ride home felt different, lighter, like the mountain itself was welcoming them back not as visitors but as people who belonged. When they crested the final rise and saw the cabin below, smoke rising from the chimney Caleb had left banked that morning, it looked like exactly what it was. Home. The cabin felt different when they returned, though nothing physical had changed. Perhaps it was just the knowledge that this was permanent now, that the law recognized what their hearts had known for months. They belonged together, belonged here, belonged to each other, in ways that transcended legal documents and court orders. Caleb watched the children scatter to their familiar corners with a lightness they'd never shown before. The weight of uncertainty finally lifted from their shoulders. Luke went straight to the barn to check on the horses, calling back updates about how they'd fared during the 2 days away. Mara started supper preparations with humming under her breath, actual melody instead of the anxious silence that usually accompanied her work. Ben settled by the fire with his writing pad, but instead of the dark images that had dominated his art for so long, he sketched the cabin with smoke curling from the chimney, 4 figures visible through the window, together and safe. That evening they sat around the table for supper, and the conversation flowed easier than it ever had. No more careful topics, no more avoiding subjects that might remind them of precarious legal standing, no more walking on eggshells around the question of what came next. What came next was simple. They lived. They grew. They became the family they'd already been in practice, but could now claim in name. So we're really Rourkes now? Mara asked, testing the name like trying on new clothes. Mara Rourke? Instead of Mara Sullivan? If you want to be, Caleb said. Or you can keep Sullivan. It's your mother's name, your history. I won't ask you to give that up. She considered this, her small face serious. Can I be both? Mara Sullivan Rourke? So I keep Ma but add you too? That sounds perfect. Luke nodded slowly. I like that. Luke Sullivan Rourke. Keeps the past but adds the future. He looked at Ben. What about you? Ben wrote quickly. Ben Rourke. Just Ben Rourke. I want to start new. Caleb felt something catch in his throat. Then Ben Rourke it is. Fresh start, clean slate, whatever you need. The little boy smiled, and in that expression Caleb saw healing he'd wondered might never come. The child who'd been broken so badly he'd locked himself away was slowly, carefully, emerging into the light. Not unmarked by what had happened. Those scars would always be there, but no longer defined solely by trauma. He was becoming something more, something stronger, something that could look forward instead of just surviving the present. The autumn weeks brought work that prepared them for winter, wood to split and stack, meat to hunt and preserve, the last of the garden to harvest before the first hard frost. Caleb taught them everything he knew about mountain survival, sharing skills he'd learned through necessity during his first winters alone. But this time the work felt different, purposeful, rather than merely surviving. They weren't just preparing for winter, they were building a foundation for a future that stretched beyond survival into something resembling normal life. Luke proved himself invaluable with the heavy work, his young body filling out with proper food and regular meals, strength developing in shoulders that had been too thin when he'd first arrived. He worked beside Caleb splitting wood, matching the rhythm of the axe with growing confidence, and they fell into the comfortable silence of men working together toward a common goal. You've grown 3 inches since January, Caleb observed one afternoon, noticing how Luke's shirt sleeves no longer reached his wrists. Going to need new clothes before snow flies. I feel different, Luke admitted. Stronger, like I'm finally growing into what I'm supposed to be instead of just trying to survive long enough to see tomorrow. That's what happens when you're not starving and scared all the time. Your body can finally do what it's meant to do, grow and strengthen, instead of just holding on. Luke buried the axe in the chopping block and wiped sweat from his forehead. Sometimes I think about the other kids still at Stillwater when we ran. Wonder if we should have tried to take more of them with us. 3 children making it through a winter storm was miracle enough. More than that, and none of you would have survived. I know, but still, you saved them anyway. Just took longer than running together would have. Your testimony, your courage to speak up, that's what brought the whole place down. Those 47 children getting real care now, that's because you 3 refused to stay silent. Caleb gripped Luke's shoulder. You can't carry guilt for choosing to survive. That's a weight that'll break you if you let it. Luke nodded, absorbing this wisdom the way he absorbed everything, carefully, thoughtfully, storing it away for future need. You ever carry guilt like that? From your lawman days? Caleb thought about arrests he'd made that still haunted him, laws he'd enforced that he'd disagreed with, the final case that had made him turn in his badge. Every lawman carries some guilt. Question is whether you let it teach you or let it destroy you. I chose to let it teach me that legal and right aren't always the same thing, and when they diverge, I side with right. That lesson brought me here, to this mountain, to you 3. So I guess even the guilt served a purpose. You think everything happens for a reason? No, I think terrible things happen randomly and senselessly. But I think we can choose to find meaning in what comes after, to build something good from the wreckage. You kids showing up here, that was just cold and desperation and luck. But what we built from it, that's choice. That's all of us deciding to make something good from bad circumstances. Luke picked up the axe again, settled into his stance. I'm glad we knocked on your door that night. So am I, son. So am I. Mara's garden had produced beyond expectations, and she threw herself into preservation with the intensity she brought to everything. Caleb watched her can vegetables and dry herbs with meticulous care, transforming the summer's bounty into supplies that would see them through the winter. She worked with her mother's techniques and her own innovations, creating stores that would keep them fed and healthy when the snow piled high. Ma would be proud, she said one evening, surveying rows of jarred tomatoes and beans. She always said a woman who could preserve food was worth her weight in gold. She taught you well. These will keep us fed all winter and then some. Mara touched one of the jars gently, almost reverently. I used to hate canning at Stillwater. They'd make us work the boiling pots for hours, can food we'd never get to eat. But doing it here, for us, for people I love, it feels different. It feels like taking care instead of just laboring. That's the difference between work and slavery. Work has purpose and dignity. Slavery is just using people up. She looked at him with those 2 old eyes that were slowly learning to be young again. Do you think we'll ever be normal? Ever just be kids who don't have to think about survival and abuse and legal battles? I think you're already more normal than you realize. You worry about your garden and your cooking. Luke worries about the horses and whether he's getting his lessons right. Ben writes stories and draws pictures. Those are normal kid concerns dressed up in the language of what you've survived. But we'll always be different. Always be the ones who came from Stillwater. Yes, but different isn't bad. Different just means you understand things other kids don't, that you've got strength they haven't needed to develop. That can be a gift if you let it. Caleb helped her lift a heavy pot from the stove. You 3 are some of the strongest people I've ever known. That strength came from surviving hell, but it's yours now to use however you want. You can let it make you bitter, or you can let it make you better. I'm betting on better. She smiled, fragile but real. I'm betting on better too. Ben's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic, though it came in small increments rather than sudden breakthroughs. His voice, silent for so long, emerged gradually, first in whispers to his siblings, then in quiet conversations with Caleb, eventually in normal speech that still carried some hesitation but grew stronger each day. The words came easier when he talked about stories he was writing or pictures he was drawing, harder when discussing anything related to Stillwater or the time before. One afternoon, Caleb found him on the porch, staring at the mountain peaks with his writing pad forgotten in his lap. "Penny for your thoughts," Caleb said, settling beside him. Ben was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I'm trying to remember what Ma looked like. Her face. but it's getting fuzzy around the edges like she's fading away. Caleb's heart clenched. How old were you when she died? 4, almost 5. Ben's voice was small, uncertain. Is it bad that I can't remember her clearly anymore? No, son. It's just what time does. Memory fades, especially from when we're young. But forgetting what she looked like doesn't mean forgetting she existed or that she loved you. How do I keep her if I can't remember her? You keep her in the things she taught you, the love she gave you, the fact that you can read and write because she made sure you learned. That's her, still living in you. The kindness you show Mara and Luke, the stories you write about families staying together, that comes from knowing what family should be because she showed you. Memory isn't just pictures in your head. It's how we live, what we carry forward. Ben absorbed this, turning it over in his mind. Did you forget your ma? Some. She died when I was about Luke's age. I remember pieces, her hands mostly, always busy with some work, her voice singing while she cooked, the way she smelled like bread and lavender. But her face is mostly gone now, just impressions rather than clear images. Does it make you sad? Sometimes, but mostly I'm grateful for what I do remember, and for the ways she shaped me that I carry even without specific memories. She taught me to be kind, to work hard, to stand up for what's right even when it costs something. Those lessons are clearer than any picture. Ben nodded slowly, then picked up his pencil and started drawing. Caleb watched the image emerge, a woman's figure, features indistinct but posture gentle, arms outstretched toward a small child. It was impressionistic rather than realistic, emotion captured more than physical detail. That's beautiful, Caleb said quietly. It's how I remember her. Not what she looked like exactly, but how she felt. Safe. Warm. Like nothing bad could happen as long as she was there. Ben's voice wavered. Then she died and everything did happen. I know, and I'm sorry. But you survived all of it, and you're here now, and you're safe. She'd be proud of that. Proud of how strong you've been. I wasn't strong. I stopped talking. I hid inside myself. Son, you survived trauma that would have broken most adults. You found a way to protect yourself when the world became too much. That's not weakness. That's survival. And now that you're safe, you're finding your voice again. That's strength. Caleb put his arm around the small shoulders. You're one of the bravest people I know, Ben Rourke. Don't ever doubt that. The little boy leaned into the embrace, and they sat together watching the afternoon light paint the mountains gold and purple, two people learning to be family despite the scars they carried. November brought the first serious snow, 3 feet falling in as many days, transforming the mountain into a white fortress. Caleb watched the children's reactions to being snowed in, looking for signs of the panic that had marked their early weeks, the fear that came from feeling trapped. But instead he saw excitement, the kind of enthusiasm children should show for snow forts and sledding and the adventure of being enclosed by weather. Luke organized an expedition to build a snow shelter, teaching Mara and Ben the techniques Caleb had shown him. They worked together with more laughter than precision, ending up with something that was more snow pile than proper shelter, but the joy on their faces made it perfect anyway. We should do this every big snow, Luke declared, his cheeks red from cold and exertion. Make it a tradition. Traditions are good, Caleb agreed. Family needs traditions. Gives you something to count on, something that marks the years and makes memories. Mara looked thoughtful. What other traditions should we have? Real families have lots of traditions, don't they? They do. And we'll build ours as we go. Some we'll borrow from what you remember from your mother. Some I'll bring from my childhood. Some we'll invent ourselves. That's how families work. They create their own culture over time. Ben wrote in the snow with a stick. Christmas? You want Christmas traditions? Caleb asked. Ben nodded eagerly, and Mara chimed in. Ma used to make special cookies, and we'd read the Christmas story together. Then we'll do that. Cookies and reading. What else? Luke considered. At Stillwater, they used to sing carols, but it always felt hollow, like going through motions without meaning. Could we sing but make it actually mean something? We can sing and mean every word. Make it about gratitude and family, and the light coming back after the darkest time of year. Caleb felt warmth spread through his chest despite the cold. We'll make Christmas our own, something that matters to us. They spent the snowed-in days planning and preparing, Mara working on cookie recipes with ingredients they had available, Luke practicing carols until he got the harmonies right, Ben drawing decorations they could make from pine boughs and paper. The cabin filled with anticipation, the kind that came from knowing something good was coming instead of dreading what might happen next. December arrived with bitter cold but clear skies, the kind of weather that turned the world crystal and sharp. Caleb took them on an expedition to cut a Christmas tree, letting Ben choose which pine would come home with them. They dragged it back on the sled, laughing when it tried to slide sideways and nearly took Luke into a drift. Setting it up in the cabin's corner filled the space with the scent of pine in winter, fresh and clean and full of promise. They decorated it with strings of popcorn Mara made, paper snowflakes Ben cut with meticulous care, small carved animals Luke whittled from wood scraps. It wasn't fancy or store-bought, but it was theirs, made with their own hands and filled with meaning. Christmas morning dawned cold and bright, sunlight streaming through the windows to illuminate the simple gifts they'd made for each other. Caleb had carved Luke a knife with his name etched in the handle, something that marked him as trusted and capable. For Mara, a wooden recipe box with her initials burned into the lid, recognition of the skills she'd developed and the care she put into feeding them. For Ben, a leather-bound journal with blank pages waiting for his stories, acknowledgement that his words mattered and deserved preservation. The children gave him gifts too. Luke a braided leather strap to replace his worn belt, Mara a new shirt she'd sewn from fabric they'd bought in town, Ben a drawing of the four of them on the mountain, carefully framed with wood Luke had helped prepare. Each gift was simple but carried weight beyond its physical form, tokens of belonging and appreciation and love. They spent the day together in the warm cabin, Mara's cookies filling the air with cinnamon and sugar, carols sung with more enthusiasm than skill, the Christmas story read aloud with Ben's voice joining for the first time, tentative but growing stronger with each verse. Outside the wind howled and snow fell, but inside they had everything that mattered: warmth, food, safety, and each other. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Caleb sat by the dying fire and thought about the year that was ending. 12 months ago he'd been alone, convinced that solitude was his destiny and his preference. Now his cabin held 3 children who called him father, in everything but name, who'd transformed his refuge into a home, who'd given him purpose beyond mere survival. He thought about the knock that had started everything, those desperate children on his porch asking only for shelter until sunrise. If he'd turned them away, sent them back into the storm, his life would be simpler now, quieter, lonelier, empty of the noise and chaos and incredible richness that came with family. He wouldn't change a single thing. The new year brought changes both subtle and profound. Luke started talking about the future with confidence rather than hesitation, making plans that stretched years ahead instead of just surviving to next week. He wanted to learn real carpentry from someone skilled, wanted to build houses that would stand for generations, wanted to create something lasting and good. "There's a carpenter in Helena," he told Caleb one evening. Fletcher mentioned him. "Said he takes on apprentices sometimes, teaches the trade proper. Do you think, could I maybe apprentice with him when I'm old enough?" "You're thinking about leaving?" Caleb tried to keep his voice neutral, not wanting to burden Luke with guilt for growing up and having dreams. "Not leaving, just learning. I'd come back. This is home. But I want to learn from someone who really knows the craft, who can teach me things you can't." Luke's voice carried both excitement and anxiety. "Is that okay? Am I being ungrateful?" "You're being ambitious and thoughtful about your future. That's exactly what you should be doing." Caleb gripped his shoulder. "Luke, I never want you to feel trapped here. You're free to pursue whatever life you want, learn whatever skills call to you. This will always be home, and you're always welcome here. But you're not obligated to stay forever just because I took you in." It's not obligation. It's wanting to come back to something that matters after going out to learn. Is that possible? Absolutely. That's how it should work. You go out, gain skills and experience, then come back and build your life with that knowledge. Make this mountain stronger because of what you learned in the world. Relief washed over Luke's face. "I want to build us a bigger house someday, one with proper bedrooms and maybe a workshop, but I need to learn how first." Then we'll make it happen. When you're 15, 16, we'll talk to this carpenter about apprenticeship. You'll learn the trade right, then come back and build whatever you can imagine. Mara's dreams were different, but equally strong. She wanted to open a restaurant someday, a place where people could come and be fed well, where food meant care and community instead of just fuel. She practiced with every meal, experimented with flavors and techniques, read every cookbook she could get her hands on. "Do you think people would really come to a restaurant on a mountain?" she asked Caleb, kneading bread with capable hands. "If the food's good enough, people will travel anywhere. But it doesn't have to be here. Could be in Helena or somewhere even bigger, wherever your skills can reach the most people. But I'd want it to feel like this, like home, like family. Not fancy and cold, but warm and welcoming, where people come and feel taken care of. Then that's what you'll build, and it'll be wonderful because you understand what real care looks like. You lived without it long enough to know its value." She smiled, the expression lighting her whole face. "I'll call it Mara's table, and there'll always be a place set for family." Ben's dreams were quieter but no less significant. He wanted to write books that helped other children who'd been through trauma, stories that showed healing was possible, that gave words to pain that seemed unspeakable. His journal filled with tales of survival and hope, characters who faced darkness and found light on the other side. "These are powerful stories," Caleb told him after reading a particularly moving piece about a child learning to trust again. "You have a gift for this." Ben's cheeks flushed with pleasure. "They're just stories. They're more than that. They're truth dressed up as fiction. They're your experience transformed into something that can help others. That's important work, son." "Do you really think other kids would want to read them?" "I think kids who've been through what you have need these stories desperately. Need to know they're not alone, that healing's possible, that the damage doesn't have to define them forever." Caleb handed back the journal. "Keep writing. Get better at the craft. Someday these stories will matter to someone who needs them exactly when they need them most." Ben hugged the journal to his chest, eyes shining with purpose and hope. The spring brought Haynes with news that Blackwell had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, that Stillwater Institution had been permanently shut down, that all the children formerly in its care were now placed in better situations. The legal battle was truly, finally over. "There's more," Haynes said, accepting coffee with a smile. "The territorial government is establishing new regulations for orphanages and children's homes. Mandatory inspections, oversight, standards for care and education. They're calling it the Stillwater Reform Act." He looked at Luke, Mara, and Ben. "Named after the place that broke the system open. Your testimony, your courage, it changed things for every orphan child in the territory." The children absorbed this with quiet pride, understanding that their suffering had at least resulted in protection for others, that the hell they'd endured might prevent similar hells for children not yet born. "Will it be enough?" Luke asked. "Laws are only as good as the people enforcing them." "You're right, but it's a start, and it's more than existed before you three spoke up. Sometimes change comes slow, but it still comes." Haynes set down his cup. "There's one more thing. The territorial government is offering reparations to all children who were at Stillwater during Blackwell's tenure. Not much, $100 per child, but it's an acknowledgement that what happened was wrong, that the territory failed in its duty to protect you. $300 total. Not enough to compensate for years of abuse, not nearly enough. But as Haynes said, it was acknowledgement. It was the territory admitting fault. That mattered in its own way." "What should we do with it?" Mara asked. Caleb thought about the money, about what it represented and what it could become. "That's your money. Earned through suffering I wish you'd never endured. You get to decide what it means and how it's used." They discussed it that evening, the three of them working through options and possibilities. Finally, Luke spoke for all of them. "We want to use it to help other kids. Maybe start a fund that helps children leaving bad situations get started somewhere safe. Clothes, supplies, whatever they need to begin again. We had you to help us start over. Not everyone's that lucky." Pride swelled in Caleb's chest, so strong it almost hurt. These children who had every reason to be selfish, to hold tight to anything they could claim as their own, were choosing generosity. choosing to transform their pain into assistance for others. That's a beautiful idea. We'll set it up proper. Make sure it helps kids who need it most. The Stillwater Survivors Fund started small but grew as word spread, other former residents contributing what they could, donations coming from people moved by the story of children helping children. It wouldn't change the world, but it would change individual worlds, one child at a time. Sometimes that was enough. Summer arrived with warmth and long days perfect for the work that needed doing. Luke started his carpentry apprenticeship in Helena, coming home every few weeks with new skills and growing confidence. Mara's garden flourished under her increasingly expert care, producing enough that she started selling preserves in town, building a reputation for quality that had people asking when she'd have more ready. Ben wrote steadily, his stories growing more sophisticated, his voice on the page stronger and clearer. Caleb watched them grow and change, becoming more themselves with each passing month, and felt the satisfaction of a job not finished but well underway. They weren't healed completely. Healing from trauma never worked that way, wasn't a destination but an ongoing journey. But they were moving in the right direction, building lives that honored their past without being trapped by it. One evening in late August, they sat on the porch, watching sunset paint the world in shades of amber and rose. The children were talking about their plans for the coming year, voices overlapping in the easy way of family, who knew they'd be heard eventually, who trusted in time and attention and belonging. Caleb listened to them and thought about how far they'd all come from that desperate January night when 3 frozen children had knocked on his door asking for shelter until sunrise. They'd given him so much more than he'd given them: purpose, family, a reason to care about tomorrow instead of just enduring it. "What are you thinking about?" Mara asked, noticing his quiet. "Just grateful. For all of this. For you 3 trusting me enough to stay." "We're the grateful ones," Luke said. "You saved us. We saved each other. That's how family works." Ben leaned against his shoulder, comfortable and trusting in a way that still felt miraculous after everything the child had survived. "Tell us a story," he said, his voice clear in the mountain twilight. "About what happens next." "What happens next is you 3 keep growing, keep learning, keep becoming whoever you're meant to be. What happens next is we face whatever comes together, as family. What happens next is we build a life worth living, right here on this mountain, and we do it one day at a time with patience and love and stubbornness." "That's a good story," Ben murmured. "It's the best story, because it's ours, and it's real, and it's just beginning." The stars emerged one by one above the peaks, familiar constellations wheeling through their ancient patterns, marking time and seasons and the endless turning of the world. Below them, the cabin glowed warm with lamplight, a beacon against the gathering dark, shelter and sanctuary and home. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys, its own work and growth and small victories. But tonight they had this: peace, safety, family, belonging. Everything that mattered contained in this moment, this place, these people who'd found each other against impossible odds and chosen to stay. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything. The years that followed moved with the rhythm of seasons on the mountain, each one building on the last, adding layers of experience and memory that transformed their small family into something solid and enduring. Caleb watched the children grow with the kind of attention a gardener gives to cherished plants, noting each change, celebrating each milestone, providing support when needed, and space when that was what they required instead. Luke's apprenticeship in Helena stretched into a full partnership with the carpenter, a gruff man named Morrison who recognized exceptional talent when he saw it. By the time Luke turned 17, he was taking on his own projects, building furniture and cabinets that carried his distinctive mark. Clean lines, perfect joinery, wood chosen and worked with respect for its natural character. He came home every month without fail, bringing stories of the work and the world beyond the mountain, but always making clear that this was still home, still the center around which everything else revolved. "Morrison wants me to stay on permanent," Luke told Caleb one evening during a visit home. "Says I could take over the business eventually, that I've got the skill and the temperament for it." "That's quite an offer. What did you tell him?" "That I needed to think about it, talk to you." Luke's hands, scarred now with the marks of his trade, worked a piece of pine he was shaping into something that might become a bowl. I want the business, want to keep building and creating, but I don't want to live in Helena full time. This mountain, this family. It's part of me now. I can't just leave it behind. You don't have to choose one or the other. Could build a workshop here, take commissions that let you work from the mountain, travel to Helena when projects require it, best of both worlds. Luke's face lit with possibility. You think that would work? I think you're good enough that people will come to you rather than you going to them. And the ones who won't make the trip probably aren't worth working for anyway. Caleb watched the careful way Luke's hands shaped the wood, seeing the boy who'd arrived half-frozen and terrified transformed into a young man with purpose and skill and confidence. You've built yourself a real trade, son. Now build the life you want around it. I want to build that house I talked about, the bigger one, with proper bedrooms and a workshop. Make this place able to grow with us. Luke set down his carving. And I want to do it right, not rush it. Maybe start this fall, work through winter when I can, have it ready by next summer. We'll do it together. Your design, your skills, but we build it as family. That seems fitting. Mara's path took her in a different direction, but with equal determination. At 16, she was offered a position in one of Helena's better restaurants, a chance to learn from a chef trained back east who recognized her natural talent. She spent 2 years there, absorbing techniques and expanding her repertoire, sending letters home filled with descriptions of dishes and methods, and the joy of working with food at a level she'd only dreamed about. When she returned to the mountain at 18, she brought with her not just skills, but a vision. I want to open a place, she told them over supper her first night back. Not in town, here. A restaurant where people come for the food and the view and the feeling of being taken care of. Somewhere between what I learned in Helena and what we have here. Professional but warm, excellent but welcoming. On the mountain? Caleb asked. That's ambitious, getting supplies up here, convincing people to make the trip. People travel for experiences they can't get anywhere else. I can offer them that. Food they can't get in town, views they can't see from the valley, the feeling of being somewhere special. Her eyes shone with the same intensity she'd once brought to keeping her siblings fed on scraps and hope. I've saved most of what I made in Helena. Combined with my share of the Stillwater money that's been growing, I've got enough to start small. A dining room in the house Luke's building, maybe a dozen seats, reservations only, intimate and special. Luke grinned. I can design it with the restaurant in mind. Proper kitchen, dining space that showcases the view, everything you need. We'd be partners then, Mara said. You build it, I fill it with food and people. We're already partners. Have been since the beginning. Ben, quieter than his siblings but no less determined, found his path through words. His stories, initially written just for himself, began finding wider audiences when a teacher in Helena read one and sent it to a publisher friend. At 15, Ben published his first story in a magazine for young people, a tale about a child finding voice after trauma that resonated with readers across the territory and beyond. The letters came after that, tentative at first, then growing in volume and intensity. Children who'd been through their own hells writing to say that Ben's words gave them hope, gave them language for pain they couldn't express, gave them permission to heal at their own pace. Adults who'd survived childhood trauma thanking him for depicting the reality of recovery, not linear or simple, but possible. I don't know what to do with all this, Ben told Caleb one evening, surrounded by letters he'd been trying to answer. They want something from me, want me to have answers I don't have. They don't want answers, they want connection, want to know they're not alone in what they've been through. Caleb picked up one of the letters, read a few lines of heartfelt gratitude. You gave them that just by telling your truth. You don't have to fix them or save them. Just keep writing honestly and let your words do their work. But what if I say the wrong thing? What if I make it worse? Son, you survived Stillwater. You survived losing your voice and finding it again. You survived thinking you were broken beyond repair and discovering you weren't. That experience, shared honestly, won't make anything worse. It might make some things better. Ben absorbed this, nodding slowly. Then I'll keep writing, and I'll answer what letters I can, the ones where I actually have something useful to say. That's all anyone can ask. The house Luke designed and built became something remarkable. a testament to his growing skill and his understanding of what their family needed. 2 stories of solid timber and stone, with bedrooms that gave everyone privacy but common spaces that encouraged togetherness. A kitchen designed to Mara's exact specifications, with a dining room that seated 16 and offered views of the valley that made people catch their breath. A workshop for Luke attached to the main structure, and a study for Ben where he could write surrounded by windows and light. They built it over 18 months, working when weather allowed, taking their time to do it right. Neighbors came to help with the heavy work, people from town who'd heard the story of 3 orphans and the man who'd taken them in, who wanted to contribute to something good and true. The raising of the frame became a celebration. Dozens of people working together under clear autumn skies, the structure taking shape through collective effort and shared purpose. Mara fed everyone who came to help, turning the construction site into an impromptu restaurant, serving food that made people understand why she wanted to cook professionally. Luke directed the work with quiet authority, earning respect through competence and genuine appreciation for every contribution. Ben documented it all in sketches and words, creating a record of community and cooperation that later became a book about building more than just houses. When they finally moved in, the old cabin stood empty behind them, and Caleb felt the weight of memory in that small structure. 7 years since 3 desperate children had stumbled out of a blizzard and changed everything. 7 years of growth and healing and becoming family in all the ways that mattered. "Should we tear it down?" Luke asked, seeing where Caleb's attention had drifted. "Use the timber for something else?" "No. Leave it standing. It's part of the story, part of what brought us here. Besides, might be useful for guests someday, once Mara's restaurant is running. People who want to stay overnight, experience the mountain fully." Mara smiled. "I like that. The place where it started becomes part of what we're building now, full circle." The restaurant opened the following spring with a soft launch. Just a few tables, people who'd heard through word of mouth and were willing to make the journey. Mara had spent months perfecting her menu, creating dishes that honored her mother's teaching and her own training, food that told stories through flavor and composition. She worked with what the mountain and valley provided, changing the menu with the seasons, making scarcity into creativity rather than limitation. The first real review came from a Helena journalist who'd made the trip expecting novelty and left astounded by the quality. "Mara's Table isn't just a restaurant," he wrote. "It's a destination, an experience, a reminder that the best food comes from people who understand that cooking is love made edible. The setting, dramatic mountain views, a dining room that feels like the home you wish you had, only enhances cuisine that would stand out anywhere. This is Montana's best-kept secret, and I'm not sure I want to share it." But share it he did, and the reservations started coming in, people willing to travel and pay premium prices for the experience Mara created. She hired help from town, a sous chef and 2 servers who made the trip up the mountain for each service. But she maintained control over everything that mattered, ensuring that every plate, every interaction, every moment lived up to the vision she'd built. "Ma would be so proud," she told Caleb one evening after an especially successful service. "All those lessons about feeding people, about making food matter, I finally understand what she was teaching me." She'd be proud of more than the cooking. She'd be proud of the woman you've become, the life you've built from circumstances that could have destroyed you. "We all built it together. I couldn't have done any of this without you, without Luke and Ben, without everyone who helped along the way. That's how good things get built, not alone, but together." Ben's writing career grew steadily, his stories finding homes in magazines and anthologies, his first novel published when he was 19 to critical acclaim and strong sales. The Silent Year told the story of a child who stopped speaking after trauma and slowly, painfully, found his voice again through connection and safety and love. Critics praised its honesty, its refusal to offer easy answers, its depiction of healing as ongoing work rather than simple destination. But more important than the critics were the letters from readers who'd lived variations of Ben's story, who found in his words permission to acknowledge their own pain and hope for their own healing. He answered what he could, met with groups of survivors when asked, became an unexpected advocate for children in institutional care and the reforms needed to protect them. "I never meant to become a spokesperson," he told Caleb during one of their evening talks on the porch. I just wanted to write true stories about hard things. Sometimes that's what the world needs most. Not people who sought platforms, but people who told truth and found that truth mattered to others. Caleb watched the sunset paint the peaks in shades of fire and gold. You doing okay with all the attention? Mostly. It's strange being recognized in town, having people want to talk about the book, like it's separate from me when it's so much of my actual life. But if it helps other kids, helps push for better oversight of institutions like Stillwater, then the strangeness is worth it. Just remember, you don't owe strangers your whole story. You can be a writer and an advocate without sacrificing your privacy or your peace. I know, I'm learning where the boundaries are, what I'm willing to share, and what stays private. It's a process. Everything worth doing is. The years accumulated like snow, each one adding layers that built depth and complexity to their lives. Luke married at 23, a quiet woman named Sarah, who worked as a teacher in Helena and understood his need to stay connected to the mountain and the family that had saved him. They built their own home on land adjacent to the main house, close enough for daily contact but far enough for independence, and started a family of their own. Watching Luke with his firstborn daughter, Caleb saw healing come full circle. The boy who'd been forced to grow up too fast, who'd carried the weight of protecting his siblings through hell, was now gentle and patient with his own child, giving her the childhood he'd been denied. He sang to her, built her toys with those skilled hands, showed her that fathers could be safe and kind and present. "You're a natural," Caleb told him, watching Luke rock his daughter to sleep with practiced ease. "I had a good teacher. You showed me what fatherhood could look like when it was done right. I just did what needed doing. You did more than that. You took 3 broken kids and showed them they weren't broken at all, just hurt. Showed us that healing was possible and family was choice. That's more than need, that's love." Luke's voice was thick with emotion. "I want Emma to grow up knowing that kind of love, that kind of safety. Want her to never doubt she's wanted and valued and home. She'll know. I can see it already in how you are with her." Mara's restaurant expanded its hours and capacity as demand grew, and with success came offers to open additional locations, to franchise the concept, to take her talents to bigger cities with larger markets. She considered each offer carefully, but always came back to the same conclusion. This place, this mountain, it's not just a location, it's part of what makes the food matter, she explained to a persistent investor. I could replicate the menu somewhere else, could train staff to cook the same dishes, but I can't replicate the feeling of being here, of eating food made with intention in a space filled with love and history. That's what people actually pay for. Take that away, and it's just another restaurant. She married at 25, a farmer from the valley who supplied much of her produce and understood her commitment to the mountain and the family that had saved her. They talked about children someday, about expanding the farm to provide even more for the restaurant, about building a life that honored both their roots and their dreams. Ben stayed single longer, focused on his writing and his advocacy work, traveling when necessary but always returning to the mountain and the study where his best work happened. He published 3 more novels, each one exploring different aspects of trauma and healing, each one reaching readers who needed exactly those stories at exactly that moment. "Do you ever want to settle down?" Mara asked him during one family dinner. "Find someone, build a life beyond the work?" "Maybe someday. Right now I'm still figuring out who I am beyond what happened to me, beyond being the kid from Stillwater who survived. I want to know myself fully before I try to share that self with someone else." Ben smiled, comfortable with his choices. "Besides, I have family. Have people who know me and love me. I'm not lonely, just selective about what I need." "That's fair. Just don't be so selective you miss out on something good because you're waiting for perfect." "I'll keep that in mind. But for now, this is enough. This is good." The Stillwater Survivors Fund grew beyond anything they'd imagined. Donations and grants turning the small pot of reparation money into something substantial. They hired an administrator, established criteria for assistance, helped dozens of children transition from bad situations into better ones. It couldn't undo what had happened, couldn't give back the years stolen or erase the scars left behind, but it could offer hope and practical help, could be the difference between a child surviving and a child thriving. Caleb watched it all from the center of the growing family, the quiet anchor around which everything else revolved. He aged gracefully, his hair going silver, his face weathering with lines that spoke of laughter and hard work and contentment. He trained horses on the land around the houses, sold breeding stock to ranchers across the territory, maintained the kind of quiet competence that people respected and sought out. But his greatest pride wasn't in his work or his land or even his growing prosperity. It was in the family that had grown from 3 desperate children and a lonely man into something sprawling and vital and good. Luke's family expanding with a second child, then a third. Mara's restaurant becoming an institution, a place people traveled specifically to experience. Ben's books changing lives and pushing for reforms that would protect children he'd never meet. On Caleb's 60th birthday, they gathered for a celebration that filled the main house to capacity. Children and grandchildren, friends and neighbors, people whose lives had been touched by the family in one way or another. The noise was tremendous, the chaos absolute, the joy palpable in every corner. Luke stood to make a toast, his voice carrying over the crowd. 20 years ago, 3 kids knocked on a stranger's door in the middle of a blizzard. We were desperate and terrified and had no right to expect anything but rejection. Instead, we found the person who'd change everything, who'd show us that family was choice, and healing was possible, and love didn't run out just because you'd been hurt. He raised his glass. To Caleb Rourke, who saved us by letting us save him right back. The toast was echoed around the room, glasses raised, voices joining in tribute and affection. Caleb felt his throat tighten with emotion, overwhelmed by what his life had become, by the fullness that had grown from one moment of choosing to open his door instead of closing it. Mara spoke next, her voice clear and strong. You taught us that survival wasn't the same as living, that we deserved more than just getting by. You taught us that our past didn't define our future, that we could build something good from terrible circumstances. You taught us what family actually means, not blood or obligation, but choice and commitment and showing up every day. She smiled through tears. You taught us everything that matters. Thank you. Ben's tribute was quieter, but it carried weight that silence often held. I stopped talking for over a year because words felt too dangerous to use. Then I met someone who showed me that words could be safe, that communication could happen in silence or speech, that being heard didn't require sound, just someone willing to listen. He looked directly at Caleb. You listened when I had no voice. You heard what I couldn't say. You gave me space to heal and time to find my words again. Everything I write, every story I tell, they exist because you showed me that words could matter in good ways, not just harmful ones. Thank you for teaching me to speak again, and then teaching me what was worth saying. Caleb stood to respond, looking out at the sea of faces, family by blood and choice, friends who'd become family, children who'd never known Stillwater but carried the legacy of surviving it through their parents' stories and strength. 20 years ago, I was alone on this mountain, convinced that solitude was safety and caring was danger. Then 3 kids showed up needing shelter, and I had to choose between the easy path and the right one. Best choice I ever made. He paused, collecting thoughts and emotions too big for simple words. You 3 didn't just change my life. You gave me one. Gave me purpose and family and reasons to wake up grateful instead of just awake. You taught me that the walls I'd built around myself weren't protection, they were prison. You set me free by asking for shelter. That's the truth of what happened here. We saved each other. He raised his glass. To family. However it's formed, wherever it's found, whoever chooses to be part of it. To the knock that changed everything, and to every day since that's proved opening that door was the best thing I ever did. The room erupted in cheers and toasts, conversations flowing back into their natural rhythm, the party continuing with the kind of joy that only comes from people who genuinely love being together. Caleb moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and affection, watching his family interact with the kind of contentment that comes from building something that works, something that lasts, something that matters. Later, after most guests had left and only close family remained, they sat together on the porch watching stars emerge above the peaks. The children, not children anymore, but adults with their own lives and families, settled into familiar positions, the physical closeness of people who'd learned early that proximity meant safety. "Tell us the story," Luke's oldest daughter asked, Emma now nearly 10 and fascinated by family history. "About how you all met, the real version, not the one for school." Luke and Mara exchanged glances, the silent communication they'd developed as children still functioning decades later. Then Luke began. "It was January, and we were running. Had been running for days through snow and cold, 3 kids with no supplies and no plan beyond surviving until sunrise." Caleb listened to the story he'd lived transformed into narrative, heard the fear and desperation they'd felt rendered in words his grandchildren could understand without being traumatized by. Heard how Luke described the decision to knock, the terror of not knowing if the stranger who answered would help or hurt, the relief when Caleb had stepped back and let them enter. Mara picked up the thread, describing those first tentative days of learning to trust, of discovering that safety might actually be possible, that one person's kindness could be enough to change everything. Her voice carried the wonder of someone who still couldn't quite believe how much had changed, how far they'd come from those desperate children to these accomplished adults. Ben added his perspective, talking about finding his voice again through patience and acceptance, and the slow building of trust that couldn't be rushed or forced. About learning that healing wasn't linear, that setbacks didn't erase progress, that family meant people who stayed even when things got hard. The grandchildren listened with the kind of attention children reserve for stories that matter, for family mythology that shapes understanding of who they are and where they come from. When the story finished, Emma asked the question children always ask, "And they lived happily ever after?" Luke smiled. "We lived. Some days were happy, some were hard, but we lived together, as family, and that made even the hard days better than being alone." "That's better than happily ever after," Emma decided. "That's real." "It is real. Most real thing in my life." The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, marking time and seasons and the endless turning of the world. Below, the valley lights sparkled like earthbound constellations. Other families in other homes building their own stories, facing their own challenges, choosing their own paths. Caleb looked at the people surrounding him, the children who'd become adults, the grandchildren who'd never known anything but safety and love. The partners who'd joined the family and strengthened it, and felt the profound satisfaction of a life well lived. Not perfect, never perfect. But good, true, worth every sacrifice and every risk. "What are you thinking?" Ben asked quietly, reading the expression on Caleb's weathered face. "Just grateful. For that knock 20 years ago. For choosing to answer it. For every day since that's proved over and over that opening my door was opening my life." "We're the grateful ones." "No. We're all grateful. That's how it works when you build something good together. Everyone gains, everyone grows. Everyone has reason for gratitude." They sat in companionable silence as the night deepened, comfortable with quiet in the way only family can be. Tomorrow would bring its own work and challenges, its own joys and sorrows. The restaurant would open, Luke would work on his current commission, Ben would write, the grandchildren would play and learn and grow. Life would continue in its beautiful, messy, imperfect way. But tonight they had this: peace and presence and the profound comfort of being exactly where they belonged, with exactly who they belonged with, doing exactly what mattered most. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of wood smoke and coming autumn. The mountain stood eternal and patient, witness to all that had transpired on its slopes, shelter for those who'd found sanctuary in its shadow. And in the house built by family for family, lights glowed warm against the darkness, beacon and promise and home. The knock that had echoed through one frozen January night had reverberated across 2 decades, transforming 4 isolated individuals into something greater than the sum of their parts. Family, chosen and built and maintained through daily acts of love and commitment and showing up. Not perfect, but real. Not easy, but worth it. Not the end of the story, but the best possible continuation. Life lived fully, together, with purpose and hope, and the bone-deep certainty that they'd found what everyone searches for and not everyone finds. They'd found home. They'd found each other. They'd found that the knock before midnight was actually the sound of sunrise arriving early, bringing light to darkness, warmth to cold, hope to desperation. And every day since had been proof that sometimes the best things in life come from the courage to open the door when strangers knock, to choose compassion over fear, to believe that healing is possible and family is choice and love is the answer to questions we didn't even know we were asking. The stars shone on, the mountains stood steady, the family gathered close, and sunrise, when it came, would find them together, exactly as they were meant to be, exactly where they belonged, exactly home.